Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back over 1,000 years to the frozen edges of medieval Scandinavia. We're stepping into the world of the Vikings. But forget the ships and the battles for now. Tonight, we're exploring something far more intimate, far more essential. We're discovering how these Norse people managed to sleep through winters that would kill most of us in a single night. Imagine darkness that lasts for months. Not just nighttime darkness, but a deep, oppressive absence of sunlight that swallows entire weeks above the Arctic Circle. Now add cold that turns your breath into ice crystals before it leaves your mouth. Temperatures that plunge to 40 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Cold so intense that exposed skin freezes in minutes. This was the reality every single winter for Viking families across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. And somehow, they had to sleep through it. You're wrapped in layers of wool and fur, lying on a wooden platform in a smoky longhouse. Outside, wind howls across frozen fjords. Inside, you share your sleeping space with parents, siblings, children, and possibly even the family's livestock just a partition away. The fire in the central hearth must be tended constantly, but carefully. Too much smoke and you suffocate. Too little flame and you freeze before dawn. This wasn't camping. This wasn't a bad hotel experience. This was survival every single night for 6 months of the year. Modern historians examining Viking settlements have found evidence of just how brutal these winters were. Skeletal remains show vitamin D deficiencies that would make today's doctors wince. Archaeological digs reveal longhouses with walls nearly 3 feet thick in some places, desperate attempts at insulation. But here's what makes this fascinating. They succeeded. Generation after generation, Vikings not only survived these conditions, but thrived enough to build ships, create art, establish trade routes, and yes, occasionally terrorize their neighbors come summer. The question isn't whether they survived. We know they did. The question is how. How did human bodies, which haven't changed much in 1,000 years, endure what would hospitalize most of us today? Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'm curious, where are you watching from tonight? And what time is it there? Drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how this community spans the globe, all of us drifting towards sleep together, separated by oceans and centuries from the Vikings, yet somehow connected through these quiet moments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the doorway of a longhouse on a January night in the year 950. The last hint of twilight disappeared 3 hours ago. It's only mid-afternoon by the clock, but the sun barely cleared the horizon today. Tomorrow it won't rise at all. You can feel the cold radiating through the wooden door, even though it's covered with hides. Behind you, deeper in a longhouse, you hear the low murmur of voices. Someone's adjusting the fire. A child asks when spring will come. The answer, though no one wants to say it out loud, is months away. Months of darkness. Months of cold. Months of sleeping in conditions that would challenge everything you know about rest and warmth. But you'll learn their secrets, one night at a time. You're not entering a house in the way you understand that word. You're entering a survival machine. The Viking longhouse was engineered over centuries of trial, error, and frozen bodies to solve one fundamental problem: how to keep humans alive when the world outside wants them dead. Picture a structure that could stretch anywhere from 50 to over 200 feet in length. The walls aren't just wood. They're double-layered timber with packed earth, moss, or seaweed filling the gap between. Some longhouses in Iceland and Greenland had stone foundations that rose 3 feet high before the wood even began. The roof, we'll explore this more later, could be 2 or 3 feet of layered turf, creating a living blanket of insulation. From a distance, these buildings looked like gentle hills that happened to have doors. And that camouflage was entirely intentional. Inside, the layout followed a precise logic. The central nave ran the length of the building, wide enough for the family to gather, work, and eat. The hearth sat in the middle, its fire the literal and metaphorical heart of the home. Along both walls, Raised platforms created sleeping and sitting spaces. These weren't beds as you know them. They were wide wooden benches, really, that could accommodate multiple people lying side by side. Think of them as sleeping shelves. Behind you, at one end, livestock would be housed during the worst weather. Cows, goats, sheep, separated from the human area by wooden partitions, but sharing the same enclosed space. Their body heat wasn't incidental. It was part of the heating system. Historians studying reconstructed longhouses have measured temperature differences of 20 to 30 degrees between the interior and exterior during winter. That might not sound like much until you realize exterior temperatures could be minus 30. A 20-degree difference means the gap between death and survival. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is something that sparks debate among archaeologists to this day. Did Vikings actually understand thermodynamics, or were they just iterating on designs until something worked? Some scholars argue that the precise positioning of smoke holes, the strategic placement of livestock, and the calculated height of sleeping platforms reveal sophisticated understanding of heat circulation. Others insist it was pure practical evolution, with successful designs being copied and failures literally freezing out of the gene pool. The truth probably lies somewhere between. They may not have had our scientific vocabulary, but they understood that heat rises, that wind kills, and that moisture is the enemy of warmth. You're standing in the center of the longhouse now, letting your eyes adjust to the dim interior. The fire casts dancing shadows across carved wooden posts. These aren't just structural. They're decorated with serpents, dragons, geometric patterns. Even in survival mode, Vikings couldn't resist making things beautiful. The air is thick, not quite smoky, but definitely hazy. The smoke hole in the roof above the fire pit lets most of the smoke escape, but not all. Your modern lungs would probably struggle with this environment. But to a Viking family, this was home. The smell is a complex mixture, with smoke, yes, but also wool that's been worn for weeks, the earthy scent of turf on the roof, something cooking in a pot suspended over the fire, and underneath it all, the animal musk from the livestock area. It's not unpleasant exactly. It's lived in. Every surface tells a story of use. The sleeping platforms are worn smooth by countless bodies. The posts are dark with years of smoke. The earthen floor near the fire is packed hard as stone from foot traffic. This building has sheltered generations. Your great-great-grandmother slept on that exact platform. Your children will sleep there too, if everyone survives this winter. And that's always the question, isn't it? The longhouse is brilliant technology for its time. Archaeologists have found examples that remain standing and functional for over a century. But it's not magic. It simply reduces the odds of freezing to death from certain to merely probable. You'll need more than good architecture to survive until spring. You'll need the right clothing, the right bedding, the right sleeping strategies. But the longhouse is where it all begins. Your fortress against the darkness. Your cave, improved and refined by centuries of Norse ingenuity. Step inside. Close the door behind you. Feel the immediate relief from the cutting wind. This is where you'll spend most of the next 4 months. This is where you'll sleep through the longest nights humanity has ever endured. Because it did. Your clothing wasn't fashion. It was your personal heating system, and if you got it wrong, you didn't get a second chance. Vikings understood something that modern outdoor enthusiasts have only recently rediscovered. Layering is everything. But their system was far more sophisticated than just throwing on extra tunics. Let's start from your skin outward. The base layer was linen. Yes, linen, the same fabric we associate with breezy summer clothing. This seems counterintuitive until you understand the science. Linen wicks moisture away from skin better than almost any natural fiber. And moisture is your enemy in extreme cold. Sweat against your skin in sub-zero temperatures creates evaporative cooling that can drop your core temperature dangerously fast. So you're wearing a long linen undershirt, probably reaching to mid-thigh. It's thin, relatively smooth, and, crucially, it keeps that moisture away from your body. Over this comes wool. Not the scratchy, uncomfortable wool of cheap modern sweaters. Viking-era wool was different. Coarser, yes, but also naturally lanolin-rich, which made it somewhat water-resistant. Your wool tunic reaches to your knees. The weave is tight enough to block wind, but loose enough to trap air. And air, trapped and warmed by your body heat, is what keeps you alive. Modern Arctic survival gear works on exactly this principle. The Vikings just figured it out 1,000 years earlier through necessity and corpses. Women wore wool dresses with the same layering philosophy, often with an overdress that provided an extra air-trapping layer. Wealthy women might have brooches, those iconic oval Norse brooches, that were functional as well as decorative, holding layers together and adjustable for temperature regulation. Your legs get the same treatment. Linen undergarments, then wool trousers or leg wraps. Historians still debate exactly how Vikings wrapped their legs. Some evidence suggests long strips of wool wound from ankle to knee. Others indicate tailored trousers. Either way, the goal was the same: trap air, block wind, wick moisture. Now the outer layer. This is where furs and leather enter the picture. A heavy wool cloak, certainly. These could be massive, reaching from shoulders to ankles. But in the depths of winter, especially for anyone venturing outside, you'd add fur. Bear fur was prized, thick, warm, prestigious. Wolf fur was common and effective. Sealskin, for coastal populations, was nearly waterproof and blocked wind like nothing else. These weren't decorative. Archaeological finds show fur garments worn literally to pieces, repaired over and over, patched with different animal skins as needed. Your life might depend on that bearskin cloak, so you maintained it with the same care a modern person maintains their car. Here's something that fascinates textile historians. Vikings understood directional insulation. Furs were worn with the hair facing out when moving. This shed snow and rain. But for sleeping, some evidence suggests they reversed them, hair against the body for maximum warmth. Whether this was universal practice or regional variation is still argued over in academic journals. Your hands and feet present special challenges. Extremities freeze first, and frostbite can turn deadly through infection even if you survive the initial injury. Mittens, not gloves. Vikings understood that keeping fingers together retained more heat. Wool mittens, possibly with leather outers for wind protection. For feet, wool socks, probably multiple layers. Then leather shoes or boots, sometimes lined with fur or stuffed with dry grass for extra insulation. And here's an odd detail that shows up in sagas and archaeological sites. Some Vikings stuffed extra wool or grass into their clothing when sleeping. This created additional insulating layers in critical areas like around the torso. It probably made them look lumpy and ridiculous. It also probably saved lives. The question of how often these layers came off is grimmer than you might expect. In the deepest winter, the answer was rarely. You might remove outer layers by the fire. You might change linen underlayers every week or two if you were fastidious and wealthy enough to own multiple sets. But that wool tunic? Those leg wraps? They stayed on for weeks, sometimes months. Modern people recoil at this, imagining the smell and discomfort. But Vikings were making a calculated trade, temporary hygiene for survival. Removing and washing clothing in winter meant either doing it inside, adding moisture to the longhouse air. Remember, moisture is the enemy, or freezing the water content, which could damage the fibers. Better to stay wrapped and alive than clean and frozen. When spring finally came, there were apparently cleaning rituals that involved a lot of hot water and relief. But that was months away. Tonight, you're layered in linen, wool, and fur. You're wearing basically everything you own, and when you lie down to sleep, most of it will stay on your body. Welcome to Viking winter fashion, where style takes a distant second place to not dying. The floor is death. That's the first thing you need to understand about sleeping in a Viking longhouse. Cold air sinks. And in a structure where the only heat source is a single fire pit, the earthen floor becomes a zone of bone-numbing cold. Sleep down there in winter, and you might not wake up. So you don't sleep on the floor. You sleep on platforms raised anywhere from 1 to 3 feet above ground level. These benches, the Vikings called them beck, ran along both long walls of the longhouse. They were built directly into the structure, not furniture you could move. sturdy wooden planks supported by posts or built as part of the wall framework itself, wide enough for multiple people to lie side by side, sometimes 6 feet deep from wall edge to the interior. Think of them less as beds and more as elevated sleeping decks. The engineering here is smarter than it first appears. By raising sleepers just a couple of feet, you escape the coldest air layer. Heat from the central fire rises and circulates through the longhouse at roughly chest height when you're lying down. So your sleeping platform sits right in the optimal thermal zone. Too high, and you'd be in the smoke layer where the air is acrid and unbreathable. Too low, and you'd be in the cold sink. The Vikings found the sweet spot through generations of adjustment. Archaeological excavations of longhouse sites show evidence of these platforms with remarkable consistency. Post holes in the ground reveal their placement, where patterns on the earthen floor show where people stepped up onto them. Sometimes you find the preserved remains of the wooden planks themselves, worn smooth by centuries of bodies. But here's where it gets interesting from a historical debate perspective. Scholars argue about whether these platforms were primarily sleeping spaces or multifunctional furniture. During the day, you sat on them for meals, for crafts, for storytelling. Children played on them. Work happened there, spinning, weaving, carving. Only at night did they transform fully into beds. Some historians suggest this multifunctionality was deliberate efficiency. Others argue it was simply necessity in cramped quarters where every square foot mattered. The answer is probably both. Your spot on the sleeping platform isn't random. Social hierarchy determines position with brutal precision. The Jarl, the chieftain or head of household, sleeps in the position of honor. This is typically along the back wall, farthest from the door, with the best protection from drafts. His wife beside him, their children nearby. Respected warriors or family members get the next best positions. Then lower status free people. Finally, thralls, enslaved workers, end up closest to the doors. This isn't just about comfort. It's about survival odds. That position near the door means you're in the draft zone every time someone enters or exits. You're sleeping in the coldest spot in the building. Studies of Viking-age skeletal remains show that lower-status individuals had higher rates of cold-related injuries and illnesses. Your place on the sleeping bench could literally determine your life expectancy. The platform's wooden surface isn't bare. That would be almost as bad as sleeping on the floor. Instead, there's layering here too. First, dried grass or hay creates a primitive mattress. This provides crucial insulation from the wooden planks, which would otherwise conduct heat away from your body. Then furs and woven wool blankets. We'll explore those in detail soon, but understand they're not optional luxuries. They're survival equipment. Some wealthy households might have had stuffed mattresses, wool or down encased in linen or leather. But for most Vikings, you're sleeping on what amounts to a thick pile of grass covered with animal skins. It sounds primitive. It actually works remarkably well, as modern outdoor survival experts who've replicated these sleeping systems have discovered. The hay compresses under your weight, creating a custom-fitted form that insulates from below. The furs trap your body heat above. You become a warm pocket in the cold air. One detail that appears in sagas and archaeological evidence: wooden dividers or curtains sometimes separated sleeping areas. Not full walls, but partial privacy screens. These served multiple purposes, some modesty, yes, but also additional draft protection. They created smaller pockets of air that were easier to keep warm with body heat. Think of them as creating microenvironments within the larger longhouse space. You're lying on your sleeping platform now. The wooden edge is smooth under your hand, worn by countless others who've slept here before you. Beneath you, the hay rustles slightly as you settle your weight. It smells like summer, oddly, dried grass preserving a memory of warmth. Above you, the roof timbers disappear into smoky darkness. Beside you, you can feel the warmth of another body, close but not quite touching. This is where you'll spend the next 10 or 12 hours. This raised wooden shelf is your refuge until dawn, or what passes for dawn in the endless winter dark. The floor below might be freezing, but up here you have chance. Now we reach the layers that mean the difference between sleep and slow freezing. Your covering, your cocoon against the cold. Vikings didn't have synthetic insulation or electric blankets. What they had was animal skin, fur, and feathers. And they understood how to use them better than most modern people understand their thermostats. Let's start with the most prized possession, bear fur. A single bear pelt could be worth a small fortune in Viking society. Not just because bears were dangerous to hunt, though they were, but because bear fur is phenomenally warm. The dense underfur traps air with incredible efficiency. The longer guard hairs shed moisture and snow. A bear skin large enough to cover 2 adults could weigh 15 or 20 pounds. That weight itself becomes part of the insulation system, pressing the fur against your body and eliminating air gaps where heat could escape. If you own a bear pelt, you were wealthy, and you'd likely survive winter better than your neighbors. But most Vikings couldn't afford bear fur, so they made do with what was available: wolf, fox, sheep, goat, seal. Wolf pelts were common and nearly as effective as bear. Seal skins for coastal populations had unique advantages. The fur was dense, and the skin itself was naturally water-resistant, crucial in damp climates. Sheepskin was democratic. Almost everyone could access it since most families kept sheep. The wool stayed attached to the hide, creating a built-in blanket. Not as warm as bear or wolf, but layered properly, entirely adequate for survival. Multiple sheepskins could be stitched together to create large sleeping covers. Here's something that appears in both archaeological finds and saga descriptions: sleeping bags. Not modern nylon sleeping bags, obviously, but sewn fur enclosures that worked on exactly the same principle. Take 2 large pelts. Sealskin was particularly popular for this in Iceland and Greenland. Sew them together along 3 sides, leaving one end open. Crawl inside. Your body heat warms the trapped air, and the fur prevents that warmth from escaping. These fur bags could be lined with wool fabric for extra insulation and comfort against bear skin. Wealthy families might have bags lined with linen for the smoothness. Now we come to something that still exists today, barely changed: eider down. The eider duck nests along Nordic coastlines. Its down, the soft underfeathers, is so effective at insulation that modern Arctic expeditions still use it. Vikings collected this down and stuffed it into fabric casings. Linen outer shells filled with eider down created pillows and blankets that were impossibly light but stunningly warm. Weight matters when you're already wrapped in heavy furs and wool. A down-filled blanket could provide warmth without the crushing weight of multiple pelts. Historians debate exactly how common eider down was. Clearly, it was known and valued. Icelandic law codes mention regulations about eider nest collection, but whether it was aristocratic luxury or widespread practice remains unclear. The archaeological record preserves furs and leather reasonably well in certain conditions. Fabric and feathers, less so. We're working with incomplete evidence. But here's what we know for certain. Vikings understood layering bedding just as they layered clothing. You didn't just throw one fur over yourself and hope for the best. You built a system. Bottom layer against the hay. A tough hide, perhaps goat skin, worn and not particularly warm but durable. This protected your valuable furs from the scratchy hay. Middle layer, wool blankets, woven tight, possibly felted for extra density. Wool maintains some insulating property even when damp. Crucial in a smoky, breath-filled longhouse where condensation is constant. Top layer, your finest fur, the warmest you could afford or hunt. This is what directly touches your body, trapping the most heat. If you were lucky enough to have that bear pelt, this is where it went. Some families also used furs as ground layers, creating insulation from below. The setup might be, hey, then a fur with the hair down, then wool blankets, then another fur with hair facing you. You're essentially sandwiched between insulating layers. And here's a detail that sounds odd, but makes perfect sense. You shared these furs. Not just with family members, but the furs themselves were shared resources. That valuable bear pelt didn't belong to one person. It was family property, used by whoever needed it most on a given night. Children, the elderly, the sick, They got priority on the warmest furs. This wasn't just compassion. It was pragmatic survival strategy. Lose a child to cold, and you've lost future labor and family continuation. Lose an elder, and you've lost knowledge and wisdom. The community survived by protecting its most vulnerable members. Some of these furs were ancient, passed down through generations, repaired endlessly, patches of different animals sewn together as the original wore through. A family might own a sleeping fur that had kept great-grandparents warm decades earlier. These weren't just functional objects. They were heirlooms, memory keepers, connections to ancestors who'd survived the same winters you now faced. You're pulling the furs up around your shoulders now. The bear pelt, you're fortunate tonight, is heavy and slightly scratchy against your wool-covered arms. But underneath, where it touches your neck, the fur is incredibly soft. You can feel your own body heat already beginning to reflect back at you. The fur is creating a microclimate, a small pocket of warmth in the cold longhouse. This is your fortress within the fortress. Wood and turf keep the killing cold at bay, but fur and down keep you actually warm. Close your eyes. Feel the weight. The darkness is complete, but the furs make it feel less like void and more like embrace. This is how Vikings slept, wrapped in the skins of animals they'd hunted or traded for, protected by the same creatures that shared this harsh landscape. Predator and prey, all of you trying to survive the winter together. You're not sleeping alone, even if you wanted to. And in winter, you absolutely wouldn't want to. Privacy wasn't really an option. The Viking approach to winter sleep was fundamentally communal. Bodies pressed together, sharing heat, creating a collective warmth greater than the sum of individual temperatures. This wasn't accidental overcrowding. It was deliberate survival strategy. Think about the thermodynamics for a moment. A single human body generates roughly the same heat as a 100-watt light bulb. Not much when you're surrounded by sub-zero air. But put 5 or 6 bodies on a sleeping platform, press close under shared furs, and suddenly you're generating 5 or 600 watts of heat. That's significant. That's survivable. The typical sleeping arrangement placed entire nuclear families on single platforms. Parents in the center, children tucked between them or pressed against their sides. Sometimes elderly grandparents would share the space. Occasionally, trusted household members or close relatives. The goal was maximum body contact with minimum heat loss. Modern people, accustomed to individual beds and personal space, find this claustrophobic. Vikings found it necessary. There's evidence in saga literature of sleeping arrangements being described in some detail, not because they were remarkable, but because they were so standard that they served as setting for various plot developments. Someone might be murdered in their sleep. Well, they were sleeping between 2 other people, so there are witnesses. A secret conversation happens at night. 2 people whisper while pretending to sleep, but they're touching 3 other family members who might overhear. The sleeping platform wasn't private space. It was shared territory. Children grew up never sleeping alone. The concept of a separate bedroom would have seemed bizarre, possibly even dangerous. Why would you voluntarily isolate yourself from the warmth of family? Here's where it gets interesting from an anthropological perspective. Scholars debate whether this forced intimacy strengthened family bonds or created tensions. Some argue that physical closeness bred psychological closeness, that Vikings had tighter family units because they literally couldn't escape each other. Others suggest that the lack of personal space was a constant source of friction, only tolerated because winter left no choice. The truth, as usual, probably varied by household and personality. But the practice was universal enough that it shaped Norse culture in ways we can still trace. The concept of free, peace within the household, takes on extra meaning when you're sleeping inches from your potentially annoying brother every night for 6 months. You learned to get along, or the winter became unbearable. Body position mattered in these arrangements. Curling together, what we might call spooning, was standard. This minimized exposed surface area and maximized heat transfer between bodies. The middle positions were warmest, obviously. Edge positions were colder, as you had air on one side, even if you had a warm body on the other. Children often got middle positions, not just because they were loved, though they were, but because children's smaller bodies lose heat faster than adults. A child sleeping on a cold edge was a genuine risk. So adults bookend the sleeping arrangement, using their larger mass as insulation for the more vulnerable young. There's also evidence of gender-based sleeping strategies. Women, on average, have higher core body temperatures than men, but feel colder in their extremities. Men generate more heat overall, but distribute it less evenly. Some historians suggest that strategic placement of men and women in sleeping arrangements took advantage of these differences. But whether Vikings actually understood and planned around this, or whether it just worked out through trial and error, is unclear. Thralls, enslaved people, present a grimmer picture of the shared warmth dynamic. They typically slept separately from the family, in colder positions near doors or in designated areas. Sometimes multiple thralls would share platforms, providing some collective warmth. But they were excluded from the prime family sleeping arrangements. This wasn't just about status. It was about trust. Sleeping deeply requires vulnerability. You couldn't relax into true rest with someone you feared or who might resent you enough to cause harm. So thralls slept apart, colder and more at risk, while the family clustered together in relative warmth and safety. The communal sleeping system had one other crucial advantage: shared breath. That sounds odd, perhaps unpleasant. But in a longhouse where the fire is burning low at night, where cold air seeps through every gap, the warm, moist air from multiple people breathing creates a microclimate under the furs. It's warmer, slightly humid air that holds heat better than the dry, cold air of the longhouse. You're essentially creating a shared atmosphere under your collective blankets. Modern sleep studies would probably have concerns about oxygen levels and carbon dioxide buildup. Vikings didn't have those concerns. They had the more immediate concern of not freezing, and shared breath helped prevent that. You're settling into your position now. Your child is pressed against your left side, small body already generating noticeable warmth where you touch. Your spouse is on your right, back against your chest, breathing slow and even. Beyond them, you can sense other family members finding their positions. A foot accidentally kicks yours as someone adjusts. Someone murmurs something unintelligible, already half asleep. The furs are pulled and tucked, creating a seal against the cold air. And gradually, incrementally, the shared space under the pelts begins to warm. It's not hot. It's not even what you'd call comfortable by modern standards. But it's warm enough. And warm enough is all winter asks. The darkness is complete. The cold is kept at bay by wood and turf and fur and family. You're not alone in the dark. You're part of a collective survival machine made of human warmth. This is how you sleep through Nordic winter. Together. Always together. The fire cannot go out. That's not a preference or a suggestion. It's an absolute rule written in frozen corpses and near-death experiences. Let the fire die completely on a winter night, and you might not have the strength to restart it before hypothermia takes hold. So, someone has to tend it. All night. Every night. For months. The central hearth in a Viking longhouse was more than a cooking spot or a light source. It was the beating heart of survival, and like any heart, it required constant attention. But here's the challenge. Fire management at night is a delicate balance. Too much fire, and you fill the longhouse with smoke that chokes sleepers. You also burn through your wood stores at an unsustainable rate. Remember, you need to make it through the entire winter, and gathering firewood in deep snow is brutal, dangerous work. Too little fire, and the temperature drops to deadly levels. The solution Vikings developed was essentially a controlled slow burn system. Before everyone settled to sleep, the fire tender, usually a designated adult, sometimes rotating the responsibility, would bank the fire. This meant arranging the burning logs in a specific way, often covering them partially with ash. The ash restricts oxygen flow, causing the wood to burn much slower. Think of it as putting the fire in low-power mode. It still produces heat, but at a fraction of the fuel consumption rate. The wood selection mattered enormously. Oak and beech were prized for overnight fires because they burn slowly and produce long-lasting coals. Pine and spruce burn hot, but fast. Useful for cooking, terrible for overnight heating. Birch fell somewhere in the middle, accessible and decent for general use. Vikings became expert dendrologists through necessity. They could identify wood by sight, smell, and the sound it made when struck together. They knew which trees grew where, which seasons were best for cutting, and how long wood needed to dry before burning efficiently. This knowledge wasn't written in books. It was passed down through apprenticeship, children watching parents, learning which logs to select for which purposes. Get it wrong, and you waste precious resources or risk the fire dying. Archaeological evidence from longhouse sites shows dedicated wood storage areas, often inside the structure. This wasn't just convenience. Wet or frozen wood burns poorly. By storing it inside, body heat and fire warmth gradually dried the logs, making them ready when needed. The fire tender's job was to wake periodically through the night and add fuel. Not large logs that would blaze up. Small pieces, carefully placed to maintain the slow burn. This required remarkable skill. You had to do it essentially blind, since the longhouse interior was pitch black except for the dim glow of coals. You couldn't afford to fumble and scatter the fire or add too much oxygen by poking around. Your hands learned to read the fire by heat and the subtle differences in radiant warmth from coals versus open flame. Some households used a type of peat, decomposed plant material cut from bogs, for overnight burning. Peat burns even slower than wood, producing steady heat with minimal smoke. Ireland and Scotland used peat extensively, and Vikings in those regions, or in Iceland, definitely adopted the practice. But peat had to be cut in summer, dried for months, and stored carefully. It was another resource to manage in the endless cycle of preparation for winter. Here's a detail that shows up in saga literature and archaeological findings. The fire was never completely alone at night. Even when everyone else slept, the fire tender remained semi-wakeful. They might doze sitting up near the hearth, wrapped in a cloak. They might lie on a sleeping platform close enough to monitor the fire's glow. But they maintained awareness. This was arguably the most important job in the longhouse during winter. Fail a fire tending, and everyone dies. The responsibility often fell to trusted slaves or lower-status household members in wealthy homes. In poorer households, family members rotated the duty. There's debate among historians about whether this was seen as burdensome or as a position of critical responsibility. Probably both, depending on your status and personality. But everyone understood that the fire tender was keeping them alive. Smoke management was the other critical skill. The longhouse had a smoke hole in the roof above the fire pit, but it wasn't a chimney in the modern sense. It was just an opening that could be partially covered with a wooden panel or hide to adjust draft. On extremely cold nights, you wanted minimal opening. Every gap lets precious heat escape. But close it too much and smoke accumulates to dangerous levels. The fire tender had to judge the balance constantly. Too much smoke, and people woke coughing, eyes burning, genuinely at risk from smoke inhalation. Too much draft, and the fire burned too fast, wasting wood and creating temperature swings. The perfect fire, the one that let everyone survive comfortably, was low, steady, producing minimal smoke and maintained throughout the night without depleting wood stores. Achieving this night after night for months was an art form. Modern people who've attempted to live in reconstructed longhouses report that fire management is far harder than expected. It requires constant attention, deep knowledge, and genuine skill. The Vikings did it every night. They had no choice. You can hear the fire tender moving now, somewhere in the darkness. A soft footstep, the barely audible sound of a log being positioned. A brief flare of light as the new wood catches, then settling back to dim glow. You don't open your eyes. You don't need to. You know the fire's being cared for. The rhythm of breathing around you continues undisturbed. The warmth under the furs remains constant. Someone is watching over the flame, and that flame is watching over all of you. In the morning, or what passes for morning in the winter dark, you'll wake. The fire will still be burning, and you'll live another day because someone refused to let it die. Look up from your sleeping platform. You can't see it in the darkness, but above you is one of the most ingenious pieces of Viking engineering. The roof. Not just any roof. A living, breathing insulation system that would impress modern architects. 3 feet of layered turf, grass, moss, and earth. Tons of weight pressing down on the wooden frame. And it's keeping you alive. The construction process for a turf roof was labor-intensive and required deep understanding of materials. First, you needed a solid wooden framework, sturdy beams capable of supporting massive weight. These timbers were often the most expensive part of building a longhouse. In areas where large trees were scarce, like Iceland, obtaining proper roof beams could require importing timber or using driftwood collected over years. Once the frame was complete, the layering began. First layer, birch bark. Laid across the wooden beams like massive shingles, the bark created a waterproof membrane. Birch bark naturally resists rot and water penetration. It's why indigenous peoples across northern climates used it for canoes and containers. This layer was critical because moisture infiltrating from above would rot the wooden structure and drip on sleeping families below. Next came a layer of compacted turf, not randomly thrown on, but carefully cut squares of earth with grass roots still intact. The roots held the soil together, preventing it from simply washing away in rain or collapsing under its own weight. Skilled builders selected turf from areas with dense root systems. Tighter roots meant more stable roof. Then another layer of turf, with the joints offset from the layer below. Like bricks in a wall, the staggered pattern prevented weak points where water or cold could penetrate. Some longhouses had 3 or 4 layers of turf. The total thickness could reach 3 feet or more in the coldest regions. Here's where it gets fascinating from a thermal perspective. That massive earth doesn't just block cold. It actively regulates temperature. During the day, what little warmth exists in winter air slowly penetrates the outer turf layers. At night, when exterior temperatures plummet, that stored warmth radiates back inward, moderating the temperature swings. It's thermal mass acting as a battery. The same principle is used in modern passive solar building design. Vikings figured it out through experimentation 1,000 years ago. The living grass on top continued growing, at least until deep winter. Those roots constantly knitted the roof together, self-repairing small gaps and cracks. It was literally living insulation. In spring, wildflowers often bloomed on longhouse roofs. Archaeological illustrations sometimes show these buildings looking like grassy hills with doors, which is essentially what they were. Some became so overgrown that goats could graze on the roof. There are documented cases of livestock actually walking across longhouse roofs. Moisture management was the tricky part. The roof had to shed rain and snow without becoming waterlogged. If the turf became saturated, it would freeze solid in winter, adding enormous weight and creating ice that could damage the structure. The solution was slight slope, enough to encourage drainage, but not so steep that turf layers would slide off. Viking builders developed an intuitive understanding of the angles needed. Too flat and water-pooled. Too steep, and the turf needed additional support structures. Archaeological evidence shows that different regions developed slightly different optimal angles based on local rainfall and snow loads. The smoke hole presented a particular challenge. You needed an opening for smoke to escape, but you couldn't just leave a gap in your carefully constructed insulated roof. The solution involved creating a raised opening, essentially a small chimney structure built up through the turf layers. This could be partially closed with wooden covers or hides, depending on weather and fire conditions. The design had to prevent rain and snow from falling directly onto the fire while still allowing smoke to escape. Historians debate the exact configurations, but archaeological remains show raised stone or wooden structures around smoke holes at many sites. Ice dam formation was another serious concern. When interior heat melts snow on the roof, water can run down and refreeze at the colder eaves, creating ice dams. These block further drainage, causing water to back up and potentially leak through. Modern houses with poor insulation face this same problem. Viking builders addressed it through careful roof design, sufficient overhang to keep the coldest areas away from critical joints, and maintenance protocols for removing dangerous ice buildup. Maintaining a turf roof was ongoing work. Spring inspections were critical. You checked for areas where turf had died or eroded over winter. You replaced damaged sections, reseeded bare patches, and reinforced weak spots. Neglect a turf roof for even one season and you risked catastrophic failure come next winter. This maintenance knowledge was passed down through generations. Young people learned to read roof conditions, which grass types indicated healthy roots, where water damage began, what animal burrows meant for structural integrity. Yes, animals. Mice, voles, and other small creatures sometimes burrowed into turf roofs. This created weak points and potential water infiltration paths. Part of roof maintenance involved monitoring and managing these unwanted tenants. The weight of the roof was both advantage and challenge. That mass provided insulation and stability against high winds. Viking regions could experience storms that would tear lighter roofs away. But it also meant the entire structure had to be massively strong. Support posts inside the longhouse weren't decorative. They were essential load-bearing elements. Archaeological excavations show that roof collapse was a genuine danger. Some sites show evidence of catastrophic failure, likely from excessive snow accumulation or structural rot. People could be killed by their own roof. So maintenance wasn't optional. It was survival. You're lying under 3 feet of earth and grass right now. Tons of weight suspended above your sleeping family. To modern sensibilities, it might seem frightening. To Vikings, it was comforting. That mass between you and the killing cold outside was your protection. The darker it was, the thicker the roof, the better your chances. You trusted the builders who raised those beams. You trusted the turf cutters who selected the best sod. You trusted your own maintenance work during previous summers. And that trust was rewarded with another night of survivable warmth. The roof creaks occasionally, wood adjusting to temperature changes, weights settling. These sounds are familiar, even reassuring. They mean the structure is alive, flexing, doing its job. Silence would be more concerning than the gentle groans of stressed timber. Above you, snow is probably accumulating, adding more weight, more insulation. The living grass is dormant now, waiting for spring, but its roots still hold everything together. Still keep the cold at bay. Still give you a chance to wake tomorrow. You hear them before you see them in the darkness. Low breathing, the occasional shift of weight, a soft bleat or moo. The livestock are just beyond the partition wall. Cows, goats, sheep, sometimes pigs. Sharing your home, your air, your winter. This wasn't because Vikings were particularly sentimental about animals, though they certainly valued them as resources. This was calculated engineering. Every cow produces roughly the same body heat as 5 or 6 adult humans. Place 3 cows in the far end of your longhouse, and you've added the equivalent of 15 to 18 people's worth of heat generation, without needing to feed them the same high-calorie diet humans require, without them taking up sleeping platform space. The animals essentially heated the building while also providing milk and eventually meat. It was brilliant resource efficiency. The typical arrangement placed livestock at one or both ends of the longhouse, separated from human living space by wooden partitions. These weren't solid walls. They allowed air circulation, which was crucial for distributing the animals' warmth throughout the structure. But they prevented direct contact, keeping manure, feed, and animal chaos out of the sleeping and cooking areas. Archaeological excavations show these partition walls clearly. Post holes indicate wooden frameworks, sometimes with wattle and daub filling, woven branches covered with mud and straw. The gaps between the weaving allowed airflow while blocking the animals themselves. Some wealthy longhouses had more elaborate stone partition walls, but even these included ventilation gaps near the ceiling. Heat rises, so warm air from the animal area naturally flowed over the partition into the human space. Cows were particularly valued for winter housing. A single cow produces about 1,500 BTUs of heat per hour. For reference, a small modern space heater produces about 5,000 BTUs. So 3 or 4 cows gave you the equivalent of a decent heater, running constantly, fueled only by hay you'd gathered in summer. Goats were hardy and adaptable, producing less heat individually but requiring less space and feed. Sheep were similar, smaller heat output but efficient resource users. Pigs were controversial. They produced good heat, and their omnivorous diet meant they could eat household scraps. But they were messy and more difficult to manage in close quarters. Not all households kept pigs inside for winter. Here's something that fascinates animal husbandry historians. The livestock survived these winters remarkably well, better in some cases than they would have outside, even with shelter. The warmth from a human fire and body heat kept the animal area at survivable temperatures. The animals, in turn, contributed their warmth to the system. It was a symbiotic heating arrangement where both species benefited. Modern farmers who've experimented with similar setups report that dairy production actually increases when cows are housed in moderately warm conditions compared to cold barns. Vikings likely noticed this too. Winter milk production would have been precious, and keeping cows comfortable enough to continue producing made economic sense. The air quality issue was real, though. Animals produce ammonia from their waste. In an enclosed space, this builds up quickly and can become dangerous. Vikings managed this through several strategies. First, regular mucking out, removing soiled bedding and manure even in winter. This was cold, miserable work, but necessary. The removed waste was often piled outside, where it froze solid and could be dealt with more thoroughly come spring. Second, fresh bedding, usually straw or dry grass, was added frequently to absorb moisture and waste. This bedding eventually composted, producing its own heat. A well-managed livestock area with deep straw bedding could actually generate significant warmth through decomposition. Third, those ventilation gaps we mentioned. Air circulation prevented the worst ammonia buildup while retaining enough heat to remain effective. The balance was delicate. Too much ventilation, and you lost the heating benefit. Too little, and the air became unbreathable. Finding the right balance was part of the inherited knowledge that kept families alive. There's archaeological evidence of feeding troughs, water containers, and hay storage in the animal areas. Vikings didn't just shove livestock into a corner and hope for the best. They managed these animals carefully, understanding that their survival through winter depended on keeping the livestock healthy and productive. Some households built raised animal platforms, similar to the human sleeping platforms but sized for livestock. This kept the animals off the cold floor, just like humans. It also made manure management slightly easier. You could sweep underneath more readily. The debate among historians centers on whether this was common practice or limited to wealthier households. The evidence is fragmentary. Social dynamics around the livestock are interesting too. Caring for the animals was typically assigned to specific household members, often young people or lower status individuals. Someone had to feed them, water them, clean their area, and monitor their health. This work was essential but not prestigious. You weren't composing heroic poetry about mucking out the cow stall. But everyone understood that without healthy livestock, the whole household heating system collapsed. There's also the question of noise. Animals don't sleep silently. Cows moo, sometimes at length. Goats bleat. Sheep make their distinctive sounds. Pigs can be genuinely loud. All of this happened just beyond a partition wall from where you were trying to sleep. Modern reconstructions of longhouse living report that the animal sounds are initially disruptive but quickly become background noise. Like living near train tracks, within days, your brain filters it out. Vikings grew up with these sounds. They were normal, even comforting. Silence from the animal area might actually be concerning. It could indicate illness or other problems. You can hear them now. The rhythmic breathing of a cow, deep and slow. A goat shift position, hoofs scraping on wood. The smell, earthy, hay-scented, unmistakably animal, is always present but not overwhelming. The air feels warmer toward that partition wall, noticeably warmer. The heat from those living bodies radiates through the gaps, mingles with the heat from the central fire, and creates the survivable atmosphere you're sleeping in. Those animals are your partners in survival. They don't know it. They're just being cows and goats and sheep, doing what cows and goats and sheep do. But their presence, their warmth, their constant metabolic furnaces burning hay into body heat. That's part of why you'll wake up tomorrow instead of freezing in the night. You share this space, this shelter, this winter, human and animal, huddled together against the dark and cold, both trying to reach spring, both dependent on the same turf roof, the same careful planning, the same desperate hope that the food stores will last and the cold won't win. It's not romantic. It's survival. But there's something profound about it nonetheless. Where you sleep determines whether you live. It's that simple, that brutal. Viking society had complex social structures, and nowhere were they more literally mapped than on the sleeping platforms at night. Your status determined your position. Your position determined your temperature. Your temperature determined your survival odds. Let's start at the top of the hierarchy. The Jarl, the chieftain or household head, occupied the position of honor. This was typically the high seat area, often centered along the back wall, farthest from doors and drafts. The high seat wasn't just symbolic during the day. At night, it transformed into the warmest, most protected sleeping location in the entire structure. The Jarl slept with his wife in this prime position. Maximum distance from cold air infiltration. Closest to the optimal heat zone from the fire. First access to the best furs and bedding. This wasn't just privilege, it was pragmatic. The survival of the household's leadership meant continuity of decision-making, maintenance of alliances, and preservation of the knowledge needed to manage resources through winter. A dead Jarl meant chaos and potentially the collapse of the entire household's survival strategy. So the best sleeping position went to the most important people. Children of the Jarl family slept nearby, often on the same platform or immediately adjacent. They received priority on warmth for different reasons. They represented the future. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster than adults. Their developing immune systems made them more vulnerable to cold-related illness. Letting a Jarl's child die of cold would be both personal tragedy and political disaster. So they slept in protected positions, wrapped in good furs, surrounded by family body heat. Next in the hierarchy came respected warriors, skilled craftspeople, or valued household members. These people might have their own designated platform sections. Not the absolute warmest spots, but still respectable positions. They'd be along the walls, but perhaps closer to the doors than the Jarl's family. They'd have access to decent furs, though not the best. Their survival was important. They represented skills, strength, and productive capacity, but not as critical as the leadership. Then came lower status free people. Farmhands, distant relatives, younger sons without inheritance. They got sleeping positions that were marginal, closer to drafty areas, perhaps near the livestock partition where the smell was stronger. They'd share platforms with multiple others, sometimes uncomfortably crowded. Their bedding would be functional but basic, sheepskins rather than bear pelts, wool blankets of coarser weave. They survived, usually, but they felt the cold more acutely. And finally, thralls. Enslaved people occupied the worst positions, typically near doors, the coldest, draftiest locations in the longhouse. Sometimes they slept on platforms, sometimes on the floor with minimal bedding. They received the poorest furs, often just rough wool blankets or worn-out pelts no longer adequate for free people. The archaeological evidence for this is stark. Skeletal remains that can be identified as likely thralls show higher rates of cold-related pathologies. Bone lesions consistent with repeated frostbite. Signs of vitamin D deficiency worse than even poor free people. Dental problems associated with malnutrition and cold stress. The sleeping hierarchy literally shaped their bodies, leaving marks in their bones that we can read 1,000 years later. Here's where it gets particularly grim. Thralls were often responsible for fire tending, staying awake to maintain the fire, as we discussed earlier. So they got less sleep than free people in colder positions with worse bedding. And they had to perform this critical function night after night, knowing that if they failed and the fire died, they'd likely be blamed and punished, even though they'd probably freeze to death along with everyone else. The cruelty of this system wasn't accidental. It was structural inequality literally built into the architecture of survival. Historians debate how rigid these sleeping hierarchies were in practice. Some argue that practical considerations sometimes overrode social rules. If a thrall was doing critical night work, they might be allowed closer to the fire for efficiency. If a high-status person was ill, they might receive even better position and bedding temporarily. Others insist the system was strictly maintained because any relaxation of social order threatened the entire hierarchy that Norse society depended on. The truth probably varied by household, region, and circumstance. But the general pattern is clear. High status meant warmth meant survival. Gender also played a role in sleeping arrangements, though this is less clearly documented. Women generally had designated sleeping areas, sometimes partially separated by curtains or dividers. Unmarried women of the household might sleep together for both warmth and propriety. Married couples slept together, with their position on the platform determined by the husband's status. Elderly people present another interesting case. In Norse society, elders were generally respected for their wisdom and experience. But physically, they were vulnerable. Older bodies regulate temperature less effectively and are more susceptible to cold. Evidence suggests that respected elders received good sleeping positions, similar to children. They got priority on warmth not just out of respect, but because their knowledge was valuable for survival. They knew the signs of coming storms, remembered previous harsh winters, understood food preservation techniques. Keeping them alive meant preserving that institutional memory. But elderly thralls or low-status old people probably didn't receive the same consideration. Age without status meant vulnerability without protection. The sleeping platform hierarchy also affected sleep quality in ways beyond just temperature. Prime positions were quieter, farther from the noise of doors opening, livestock sounds, and household traffic. They were more stable. Central platform sections didn't rock as much when other people moved. They offered more space. You weren't crammed against the edge, worrying about falling off in sleep. All these factors compounded. High-status people got better positions, which meant better sleep, which meant better health and cognitive function, which helped maintain their high status. Low-status people got worse positions, poorer sleep, worse health, less capacity to improve their situation. The system reinforced itself through the simple geography of sleeping arrangements. You're lying in your assigned position now. If you're fortunate, you're somewhere in the middle to warm zone. Not the absolute best spot. You're not the Jarl, but not suffering near the door. You can feel the difference in temperature just by moving your hand toward the exterior wall. Inches matter. The person sleeping one platform over, closer to the door, is noticeably colder. You can hear it in their breathing, slightly faster, slightly shallower, their body working harder to maintain temperature. Farther in, toward the high seat, you imagine, or perhaps know, the Jarl is sleeping deeply, comfortably warm under the finest bear pelt the household owns. This is Viking society made spatial. Hierarchy rendered in heat and cold. Power measured in degrees of warmth. And everyone knows exactly where they stand by knowing exactly where they sleep. The drinking horn passes from hand to hand in the darkness. Mead, thick and honey-sweet, or ale, earthy and substantial. Not a celebration exactly, more like medication. Vikings understood that alcohol warms you from the inside, or at least it feels that way. The reality is more complicated, and whether they fully understood that complication is a source of ongoing historical debate. Let's start with what alcohol actually does to your body in cold conditions. When you drink, blood vessels near your skin's surface dilate, expand. This brings warm blood from your core closer to your skin. You feel flushed, warm, almost glowing. It's a genuine sensation, not imaginary. Your skin temperature actually increases. But here's the catch that modern physiology has clearly identified. That warmth at your surface means you're losing core body heat faster. You're essentially increasing your heat loss rate while feeling warmer. In extreme cold, this can accelerate hypothermia even as you feel more comfortable. The question historians wrestle with is, did Vikings know this? Or did they just know that drinking made them feel warmer and helped them sleep? The evidence suggests a bit of both. Vikings weren't stupid, and they were keen observers of cause and effect. They must have noticed that people who drank heavily before sleeping in very cold conditions sometimes didn't wake up. The sagas occasionally mentioned deaths associated with drunkenness and cold, but they also clearly used alcohol deliberately as a sleep aid and comfort during winter. The practice was too widespread and consistent to be accidental. Mead was the high-status winter drink. Made from fermented honey, water, and sometimes herbs or spices, mead was expensive because honey was precious. It required extensive beekeeping, careful fermentation, and months or years of aging for the best quality. A household with good mead stores was demonstrating wealth and planning. The alcohol content could be substantial, anywhere from 8 to 20%, depending on fermentation techniques. Ale was more democratic. Made from fermented grains, barley primarily, it was the everyday drink for most Vikings. Lower alcohol content than mead, typically 2 to 5%. But consumed in quantity, it still provided the warming sensation and caloric content that made winter more bearable. Women typically brewed the ale, and brewing skill was a valued household competency. A woman known for good ale was sought after, respected, and her household would be seen as well-managed. Here's something that fascinates nutritional historians. The caloric content mattered as much as the alcohol. Mead and ale both contained sugars and carbohydrates. Drinking a horn of mead could provide 200 to 300 calories. In winter, when you're burning calories constantly just to maintain body temperature, when food stores are being carefully rationed, that caloric input is significant. So Vikings might have been using alcohol as a calorie delivery system as much as for its intoxicating or warming effects. The distinction between those purposes probably wasn't clear to them. They just knew drinking helped. The social aspects of winter drinking are well documented in saga literature. Long nights in the longhouse naturally led to storytelling, and storytelling went better with drinking. The communal passing of horns or cups created social cohesion during months when people were trapped in close quarters with growing tensions and cabin fever. Alcohol smoothed social friction, made uncomfortable sleeping arrangements more tolerable, and helped people fall asleep despite cold, discomfort, and anxiety about whether food would last until spring. But there were dangers that Vikings clearly recognized. Excessive drinking could lead to violence in close quarters. The sagas are full of tales of drunken fights, murders committed during feasts, and feuds that started over drinking disputes. Violence in winter, in the confines of a longhouse, was particularly dangerous because there was nowhere to escape, no way to cool tensions except time. And killing or seriously injuring a household member in winter could mean one fewer person to do critical work, which threatened everyone's survival. So there were social mechanisms to moderate drinking. The household head controlled the ale stores and could limit distribution. Social pressure encouraged drinking enough to be convivial, but not so much as to become dangerous. Women, who brewed and often served the drinks, had informal but real power to slow down excessive consumption. Some scholars argue that the famous Viking berserkers, warriors who supposedly worked themselves into frenzied states before battle, might have used alcohol or other substances as part of their preparation. Whether this extended to winter drinking practices is debated. The consensus is probably not. Winter required control and careful resource management, not frenzy. There's also evidence of herbal additions to winter drinks. Various plants with medicinal properties were sometimes added to ale or mead. Herbs like yarrow, bog myrtle, or juniper might have been used for flavor, but they also had mild medicinal effects, anti-inflammatory properties, digestive aids, even mild sedative effects that would help with sleep. Whether Vikings understood these as medicine or just as traditional practice is unclear. The line between food, drink, and medicine was much blurrier in medieval cultures than in our modern categorizations. The morning after winter drinking had its own challenges. Hangovers in a cold longhouse with chores that couldn't be delayed, fire maintenance, animal care, food preparation, must have been miserable. But Vikings seemed to accept this as part of the winter cycle. Drink enough to sleep through the cold night. Wake with a headache, but alive. Do the necessary work. Repeat. You're taking your turn with the drinking horn now. The mead is thick, coating your mouth, sweet, but with complex undertones. Honey, yes, but also herbs you can't quite identify, and the sharp bite of alcohol. It burns slightly going down, then spreads warmth through your chest. Almost immediately, you feel your face flush. Your fingers and toes, which have been cold despite the furs, suddenly feel warmer. It's pleasant, this sensation, comforting in a way that transcends the physical warmth. You pass the horn to the next person. Around you, voices are relaxed, even cheerful. Someone is telling a story. You've heard it before, but it doesn't matter. The familiar words are soothing. The shared drinking creates a bubble of warmth and community against the dark and cold pressing in from outside. You'll sleep soon. The alcohol will help with that. Whether it's actually helping you survive the cold or just making the experience of cold more bearable, well, that's a question for scholars centuries from now. Tonight it's working. That's enough. The sun isn't coming back. That's how it feels, anyway, as December deepens and the darkness becomes total. Above the Arctic Circle, and remember, significant Viking settlements existed in northern Norway. Well into this zone, the sun literally doesn't rise for weeks. Even farther south, in Denmark or southern Sweden, winter days shrink to just a few hours of dim twilight. You wake in darkness. You work in darkness. You sleep in darkness. And somewhere in the deepest part of your brain, ancient and primal, a voice whispers that maybe this time the sun won't return at all. The winter solstice, the longest night of the year, was a critical moment in Viking winter survival. Not just physically, though the cold was typically at its worst around this time, but psychologically. This was the test of whether you could hold on through the darkest period, whether your mind could survive what your body was enduring. Modern psychology has extensive documentation of seasonal affective disorder, depression triggered by lack of sunlight. The mechanism is well understood now. Reduced sunlight disrupts circadian rhythms and decreases serotonin production in the brain. Vikings didn't have this vocabulary, but they absolutely experienced these effects. The sagas occasionally reference winter sickness, periods of listlessness, irritability, or melancholy that afflicted people during the darkest months. Some scholars interpret these references as acknowledgement of what we now call seasonal depression. The Viking response was community and ritual. The winter solstice wasn't just noted, it was marked with Yule celebrations. Now, the modern Christmas holiday has absorbed and transformed many Yule traditions, making it difficult to know exactly what Vikings did. But we have enough archaeological and textual evidence to piece together some practices. Feasting was central. This seems counterintuitive. You're in the middle of winter, food stores are precious. Why have a feast? But the psychological benefit was enormous. Breaking the monotony of ration meals with a genuine feast, even a modest one, gave people something to anticipate and remember. It created a bright spot in the darkness, literally and figuratively. The feast typically involved sacrificing an animal from your livestock. A pig was traditional, though cattle or goats could substitute. This provided fresh meat, a rarity in deep winter when most food was preserved or dried. The psychological impact of fresh food after months of dried fish, salt meat, and stored grains shouldn't be underestimated. The sacrifice also had ritual significance. Offerings to the gods, particularly Odin and Freyr, were part of Yule celebrations. These weren't just superstitious gestures. While they were superstitious, but they served real psychological functions. The rituals created structure and meaning during a time when survival felt precarious and the universe felt hostile. Performing the same rituals your ancestors had performed, rituals that had preceded successful survivals of previous winters, created a sense of continuity and control. Light was another crucial element. Extra fires were lit during Yule celebrations. Torches, oil lamps, any source of light was used to push back the darkness. The symbolism was obvious, but no less powerful for being obvious. You were fighting the dark, asserting human warmth and light against the cold void of winter night. Some evidence suggests that Yule logs, large logs meant to burn for the entire celebration period, were a Viking tradition. Choosing the largest, best-burning log available, lighting it with ceremony, and keeping it burning for days created a focal point for the celebration and a tangible symbol of endurance. Storytelling reached its peak during Yule. The skalds, professional poets and storytellers, earned their keep during these darkest nights. They recited the old stories, the hero tales, the legends of gods and giants. These weren't just entertainment, though they were certainly that. They were cultural memory, identity reinforcement, and psychological survival tools. When you're cold, scared, and wondering if you'll see spring, hearing about heroes who faced impossible odds and triumphed gives you something to hold on to. The stories reminded Vikings who they were, where they came from, and that their ancestors had survived winters just as brutal. Music and drinking went together with the storytelling. Drums, simple stringed instruments, singing. Archaeological finds include various musical instruments, and saga descriptions mention music during feasts. The noise, warmth, and social connection of communal celebration were antidotes to the isolation and depression of winter darkness. Children featured prominently in Yule celebrations in ways that suggest deliberate psychological intervention. Games, treats made from precious honey or dried fruits, special attention from adults. These created positive memories during an otherwise grim season. For children growing up in these conditions, having something joyful associated with deep winter helped them psychologically endure future winters as adults. They had proof, embedded in childhood memory, that winter could contain moments of warmth and happiness. The timing of Yule, around the winter solstice, was crucial. This was the turning point. After the solstice, days began, imperceptibly at first, growing longer. The sun was returning. It might be months before you'd feel genuine warmth, but the trajectory had changed. The celebration acknowledged this turning point and gave people hope to hold through the remaining cold months. Historians debate how much Vikings understood about astronomical cycles. They clearly tracked the sun's movement well enough to identify the solstice. Whether they understood the mechanics, that Earth's axial tilt caused the seasons, is less certain. But they didn't need to understand the mechanism to use the knowledge. They knew the solstice marked the return of the sun, and that knowledge was enough. Some households marked the passing of winter by carving notches in wooden sticks. A tally of days survived, days remaining. This physical, visible counting down gave people concrete progress to observe. You could see yourself advancing toward spring, one notch at a time. The psychological research on goal visualization and progress tracking shows this is remarkably effective for maintaining motivation through difficult periods. Vikings stumbled onto this technique through necessity. You're participating in a Yule feast now. There's fresh roasted pork, the smell almost overwhelming after months of preserved foods. The fire has been built up higher than usual, an extravagance of fuel, but justified for this one night. Extra oil lamps burn, creating more light than you've seen in weeks. People are talking, laughing even, voices loud and animated in ways they haven't been for months. A skald is preparing to recite. The drinking horn makes its rounds more frequently than usual. Children are running between the adults, excited and loud, allowed to stay up late for this special night. Outside, the darkness is total and the cold is crushing. But inside, for tonight, there is light and warmth and community and hope. The sun will return. Spring will come. You will survive this winter because your ancestors survived their winters. The stories say so. The ritual promises it. And tomorrow, the days will begin growing longer. Infinitesimally, imperceptibly, but longer nonetheless. The turning point has been reached. The worst is behind you. Or at least, you can tell yourself that. And sometimes, the story you tell yourself is what keeps you alive. Let's talk about something modern people find disturbing. You don't undress for bed. Not really. Not in deep winter. That old tunic you're wearing? It stays on. Those leg wraps are trousers. They stay on. Even your innermost linen layer might stay against your skin for days, weeks, or in the depths of winter, months at a time. The outer layers come off, yes. Your heavy cloak gets set aside when you settle onto the sleeping platform. Maybe your fur vest if you have one. Your boots, definitely those come off, though you might keep woolen foot wraps on. But the core layers, the ones against your skin and providing the base insulation, those stay put. This isn't laziness or lack of hygiene awareness. It's calculated survival strategy. Every time you remove a layer of clothing, you expose yourself to cold air. Your body temperature drops. Getting warm again requires burning calories you can't spare and time you might not have before hypothermia sets in. Moreover, your clothing has absorbed your body heat over hours or days. The air trapped in the wool fibers is warm. Remove the clothing and you lose that pre-warmed insulation. Put it back on and you start from cold again, your body working to rewarm everything from scratch. It's thermodynamically inefficient. So you keep it on. The smell is what modern people fixate on. And yes, unwashed wool worn continuously for weeks develops a distinctive odor. Body oils, sweat, smoke from the fire, animal smells from the livestock area, all of it permeates the fabric. But here's what's important to understand. Everyone smells the same. When everyone in a longhouse is equally pungent, no one is particularly offensive. Your nose adapts within days. What seems unbearable to fresh modern sensibilities becomes normal, then unnoticeable. Vikings had bigger concerns than smell, like not freezing to death. There's also a practical element that historians sometimes overlook. Medieval fabric was expensive. A good wool tunic represented significant investment. The sheep, the shearing, the cleaning and processing of wool, the spinning in a thread, the weaving, the cutting and sewing. That garment might be one of only 2 or 3 you owned. You couldn't casually wash it every few days because washing in winter meant either heating large quantities of water, expensive in fuel, or using cold water that wouldn't clean effectively and might damage the fabric through ice crystal formation in the fibers. So you preserved your clothing by wearing it continuously and washing only when absolutely necessary, typically in spring when water was more available and drying was possible. The linen underlayer served a specific function in this system. Linen, as we discussed earlier, wicks moisture away from skin, but it also could be changed more easily than the heavier outer layers. If you were wealthy enough to own multiple linen undergarments, you might change your underlayer every week or 2. This provided the psychological and hygienic benefit of some freshness without the thermal cost of removing all your insulation. The removed linen could be washed, easier than washing wool, and the presence of relatively clean fabric against your skin helped prevent some of the skin problems that arise from continuous clothing wear. But most Vikings probably didn't have multiple linen undergarments, so even this layer stayed on for extended periods. Skin health became a concern during these months of continuous clothing. Rashes, infections, and irritations could develop from fabric rubbing the same areas day after day without relief. Vikings dealt with this through periodic inspections and treatments. Animal fats, seal oil, bear grease, butter were rubbed on problem areas to reduce friction and maintain skin integrity. Some herbs with antiseptic properties might be used if infections developed, but mostly you endured. Minor skin irritation was preferable to major hypothermia. Children and infants present special challenges in this continuous clothing system. Babies grow quickly, and their clothing needs changed. Moreover, babies and young children have less ability to regulate body temperature and are more susceptible to both cold and overheating. Evidence suggests that infants were kept in wrappings, essentially swaddled in wool or linen, and these wrappings were changed more frequently than adult clothing, both for hygiene and for size adjustment. Young children's clothing was probably changed or adjusted more often than adults as well, since children playing and moving around generated more sweat and dirt. But even for children, the principle held: keep layers on unless absolutely necessary to remove them. Sleep in your clothes. Wake in your clothes. Live in your clothes until spring. The psychological adjustment to this takes time, according to modern people who've attempted Viking winter reenactments. The first few nights of sleeping fully clothed feel restrictive and uncomfortable. You're aware of the fabric against your skin, The way it twists when you turn, the slight sense of constriction around your waist or legs where garments are tied. But after a week or so, it becomes normal. You stop noticing. Your body adapts. Some reenactors report that sleeping in multiple clothing layers eventually feels more secure than sleeping without them, like being wrapped in a constant, mobile blanket that moves with you. There's also a practical advantage during night emergencies. If something happens, a fire breaks out, an animal breaks loose, someone falls ill, you can respond immediately. You're already dressed. In summer, Vikings might sleep more lightly clothed or even naked in very warm weather. But winter allowed no such vulnerability. You had to be ready to function at any moment, and that meant staying clothed. The arrival of spring and the ability to finally remove these layers must have been a profound relief. Saga literature occasionally mentions ritual bathing and clothing changes associated with spring festivals. These weren't just spiritual cleansing. They were literal, physical relief after months of continuous wear. Imagine the feeling of removing wool that's been against your skin for 3 months. The air on your bare arms must have felt shocking, almost cold despite being spring. Your skin, pale and probably marked with irritation or rashes, finally exposed to light and air. And then fresh clothing, washed, aired, perhaps even newly made over the winter against your body. That moment was probably one of the highlights of the Viking year. But that's months away. Tonight, you're settling onto your sleeping platform, wearing essentially everything you've worn all day. Your wool tunic, slightly damp from sweat and humidity, is warm from your body heat. Your leg wrappings are secure, if somewhat loosened for comfort. Your linen underlayer, you can't remember the last time you removed it, has become like a second skin. You pull the furs up over these layers, creating your cocoon of insulation. Clothing below, furs above, warmth trapped between. This is how you sleep. Not naked and vulnerable like a modern person in a heated bedroom, but armored in wool and linen, ready for whatever the night brings. Dressed for survival. Because survival is what every night is about. You're breathing poison. Not much, not quickly lethal. But every breath in the longhouse contains carbon monoxide, particulates from smoke, and reduced oxygen compared to fresh air. This is the price of warmth. And managing that price, balancing breathable air against survivable temperature, was one of the most delicate calculations Vikings made every single night. Fire produces smoke. That's unavoidable with wood combustion, especially the slow-burning fires Vikings maintained overnight. Smoke contains carbon monoxide, which is genuinely deadly in sufficient concentrations. It also contains particulates, tiny bits of ash and incompletely burned material that irritate lungs and can cause long-term respiratory damage. Modern studies of people living in smoke-filled environments show increased rates of lung disease, reduced lung capacity, and earlier mortality from respiratory causes. Vikings living in longhouses all winter experienced these effects. The archaeological skeletal record shows evidence of respiratory issues in Viking populations at rates higher than you'd expect from other causes. Their lungs bore the cost of staying warm. But the alternative, freezing to death, was immediate rather than gradual. So they accepted the smoke and managed it as best they could. The smoke hole in the roof was the primary ventilation mechanism. This opening, typically centered above the fire pit, allowed smoke to escape upward. Hot air rises, and smoke is hot, so the natural convection created an upward draft that pulled most smoke out of the living space. Most, but not all. The smoke hole couldn't be too large, or you'd lose too much heat. Warm air escaping through the roof meant cold air being drawn in through gaps around doors and walls to replace it. This created drafts and temperature loss that could be dangerous. But make the smoke hole too small and smoke accumulated to dangerous levels. The optimal size was something Viking builders learned through generations of experience. Too many suffocated families taught the lesson permanently. Archaeological evidence shows smoke holes of surprisingly consistent sizes across different regions and time periods, suggesting that optimal dimensions have been worked out and were being transmitted as building knowledge. The smoke hole also needed to be adjustable. On extremely cold nights with fierce winds, you wanted it as small as possible to retain heat, even if that meant tolerating more smoke. On milder nights, or when the fire was built up for cooking, you wanted it larger to vent the increased smoke production. The mechanism for adjustment was usually a wooden cover that could be slid partially across the opening, or sometimes a hide that could be positioned to partially block the hole while still allowing some ventilation. Operating this cover was part of the fire tender's responsibilities. Reading the balance between smoke level and temperature, adjusting the ventilation throughout the night, required constant attention and developed skill. Too much smoke, and people woke coughing, eyes burning, genuinely at risk. Get it wrong enough, and people died of carbon monoxide poisoning in their sleep, probably not understanding what had killed them, just that someone went to sleep and didn't wake up. But ventilation didn't only come from the smoke hole. The longhouse had countless tiny gaps and cracks. Medieval construction wasn't airtight. Gaps between wall planks around door frames, where the roof met the walls. All of these allowed air infiltration. In summer, this was probably welcome cooling. In winter, these gaps were drafts and heat loss points, but they also provided crucial fresh air that prevented complete oxygen depletion. Vikings tried to seal the worst gaps with moss, fabric, or clay, but they couldn't and probably didn't want to seal everything completely. Some air exchange was necessary for survival. The trick was controlling where and how much. Strategic gaps near the floor allowed cold, fresh air to enter low, where it would be warmed by the fire before rising to breathing height. Gaps near the ceiling allowed the smokiest air to escape without needing to go through the smoke hole. This created a circulation pattern. Fresh air in low, warming as it rose, smoke out high. When working properly, this system kept the breathing zone, roughly the height of someone sitting or lying down, relatively clear while allowing the smokiest air to stay high and eventually vent. But it didn't always work properly. Wind direction affected everything. A strong wind from the wrong direction could reverse the draft, actually blowing smoke back down the smoke hole into the longhouse. Or wind could create such strong suction that the fire burned too hot and fast, wasting fuel and creating dangerous temperature swings. On the calmest nights, when there was no wind to assist ventilation, smoke could become particularly problematic. The fire tender had to monitor wind conditions and adjust both the fire and the ventilation accordingly. This required understanding how weather patterns affected smoke behavior, knowledge passed down and learned through practical experience. Some longhouses had secondary ventilation openings, small gaps deliberately left in gable ends or high walls. These weren't large enough to lose significant heat, but provided additional paths for air circulation. Whether this was standard practice or an innovation by particularly clever builders is debated by archaeologists. The evidence is fragmentary, since these would have been small features that don't always leave clear archaeological traces. The health consequences of chronic smoke exposure were real and cumulative. Modern medical analysis of Viking-age skeletal remains shows pathologies consistent with long-term smoke inhalation. Scarring in sinus cavities, indicators of chronic respiratory inflammation, and lung tissue damage when preserved soft tissue is available for analysis. Vikings paid a price in health and lifespan for their heating method. But again, the calculation was immediate survival versus long-term health consequences. When you're facing death by freezing this winter, lung damage that might shorten your life by a few years, decades from now, is an acceptable trade. Children were particularly vulnerable to smoke exposure. Their smaller bodies and developing lungs were more susceptible to damage. But there was no alternative. Children lived in the same smoky environment as adults. Some evidence suggests that infants were kept in slightly elevated positions, possibly hung in cradles or placed on higher sleeping platforms, to keep them in cleaner air above the worst smoke layer near the fire. But this is interpretive. We're reading between the lines of archaeological evidence and saga descriptions. You're lying on your sleeping platform now, and you're aware of the air. It's not fresh. There's a haziness, even in the darkness. You can see it when you look toward the fire's glow, a thickness to the air that catches the light. Your eyes sting slightly. They've been stinging for months now, so you barely notice anymore. Your throat has that slight scratchy feeling that's become constant during winter. You can hear someone else coughing in the darkness, a dry, harsh sound that repeats for several seconds before stopping. The fire tender is adjusting something. You hear movement, see a brief change in the light pattern. Maybe adjusting the smoke hole cover, maybe repositioning logs to change the burn rate. The air quality shifts slightly, not dramatically better, but marginally clearer. You take a deeper breath, testing it. Still smoky, but breathable. Good enough. It has to be good enough, because outside that smoke-filled air is air so cold it would freeze your lungs. You'll take the smoke. You'll breathe it all winter. And in spring, if you survive, you'll cough up black phlegm for weeks as your lungs try to clear themselves. But that's spring's problem. Tonight's problem is staying warm enough to reach tomorrow. And that means fire. And fire means smoke. The equation is simple, even if the balance is delicate. Breathe the poison and live. Refuse it and freeze. Not much of a choice, but it's the choice winter offers. And you accept it, breath by smoky breath, through the endless dark. The youngest and the oldest sleep in the warmest positions. This isn't sentiment. It's ruthless pragmatism dressed as care. Because if the child dies, the future dies with them. And if the elder dies, decades of survival knowledge vanishes into the frozen ground. Let's start with the children. A 5-year-old child has a surface area to body mass ratio that works against them in cold conditions. More skin surface relative to their internal volume means faster heat loss. Their metabolic systems haven't fully developed the shivering response that adults use to generate heat. They can't articulate when they're dangerously cold. They just become quiet, lethargic, and if you don't recognize the signs, they slip into hypothermia without complaint. Vikings understood this through observation and bitter experience. Children who slept in cold positions didn't survive winter. So children slept in the center of family clusters, surrounded by adult body heat. They got priority on the thickest furs. They were checked throughout the night, a parent's hand reaching over to touch the child's neck or chest, confirming warmth, confirming life. This wasn't just protective instinct, though that certainly existed. It was investment protection. That child represented years of pregnancy, birth risk, feeding, and care. They represented future labor once they grew old enough to work. They represented continuation of the family line and potential alliances through marriage. Losing a child to cold meant losing all of that. So you kept them warm. You gave them the center position, even if it meant you slept colder at the edge. You woke shivering but alive, and your child woke warm and alive, and the investment continued. Infants were the most challenging. They couldn't regulate their temperature at all effectively. They needed frequent feeding, which meant mother and infant had to sleep in close contact. But infants also couldn't communicate distress clearly. All crying sounds similar to exhausted parents in the dark. Was the baby cold, hungry, ill, or just fussing? Some evidence suggests that Viking mothers used a form of co-sleeping where the infant was kept against the mother's body, often inside the mother's clothing for maximum warmth and convenience for night feeding. This is similar to practices in many cold climate cultures around the world. Modern safety guidelines warn against adult-infant co-sleeping because of suffocation risk, and that risk was certainly present for Vikings too. Saga literature and law codes occasionally reference cases of overlaying, adults accidentally smothering infants during sleep. It was recognized as a tragedy, but also an accepted risk. The alternative, trying to keep an infant warm separately, had even higher mortality rates. So mothers slept with infants against their bodies, hyper-aware even in sleep, and prayed to whatever gods they believed in that they wouldn't roll over wrong in the darkness. Toddlers and young children faced different challenges. They moved during sleep, kicking off furs, rolling into colder positions. They needed to be repositioned throughout the night, tucked back into warmth, covered again. This was often assigned to older siblings or to the parents sleeping on the edge of the family cluster. Your sleep was interrupted constantly through winter, checking children, adjusting coverings, ensuring no small body had somehow worked its way toward danger. Child mortality rates in Viking society were high by modern standards. We have some statistical evidence from burial sites, high numbers of child graves. How many of these deaths were cold-related versus disease, malnutrition, or accident is difficult to determine. But winter was clearly a dangerous time for children, despite all the protective efforts. The children who survived to adulthood were literally the toughest, the ones whose bodies could handle the cold stress, whose immune systems fought off the infections that flourished in close winter quarters, whose luck held through dozens of potential accidents and illnesses. Natural selection was brutal and immediate. Now the elderly. They faced opposite problems from children in some ways, similar ones in others. Older bodies lose the ability to generate heat efficiently. Circulation decreases, metabolism slows, the shivering response becomes less effective. An elder can be dangerously cold while appearing fine. Their bodies stop sending clear distress signals. But elders had something children lacked: knowledge. A 70-year-old Viking, rare but not impossible, had survived perhaps 50 winters. They remembered the winter when the snow was so deep that livestock couldn't be fed outside. They knew which herbs treated which illnesses. They recalled the signs of approaching storms that younger people hadn't learned to read yet. They were living libraries of survival information. Losing an elder meant losing that knowledge. Written records were minimal in Viking culture. Most knowledge transmission was oral, passed directly from experienced to inexperienced. So keeping the elderly alive wasn't just family loyalty, it was preserving critical survival data. They got good sleeping positions, priority on warmth, and careful attention to their needs. Not always out of love, though family bonds certainly existed. Sometimes out of practical recognition that their death would make everyone's survival harder. There's evidence that respected elders received particular care. A grandmother known for her weaving skill, her medicinal knowledge, or her ability to predict weather would be valued and protected. A grandfather who remembered detailed family history, maintained alliances through storytelling, or possessed specific craft skills would receive priority treatment. But elders who were seen as no longer contributing, those whose minds had failed, who couldn't work anymore, who were viewed as consuming resources without providing value, probably received less protection. The sagas hint at this uncomfortable reality. Stories of elderly people choosing to die, sometimes walking out into the cold deliberately, sometimes in ritual circumstances that may have been voluntary or may have been encouraged by families struggling with too many mouths to feed. Whether these stories represent actual common practices or exceptional cases is debated by historians. But they reveal that Viking society recognized the tension between caring for non-productive members and ensuring the survival of the productive core. It's easy to judge this from our comfortable modern perspective. But Vikings weren't operating with surplus resources. They were making daily calculations about survival odds. Sometimes those calculations were harsh. In the darkness of the longhouse, you can hear an elderly voice murmuring. Someone's grandmother, talking in her sleep, or perhaps not fully asleep, reciting something. Maybe a prayer, maybe a memory, maybe just words to fill the dark. Near her, someone is sleeping close, monitoring. She's valued in this household, respected, and her survival is prioritized. On another platform, a child whimpers briefly, then settles as a parent's hand touches them, offers comfort and warmth. The child burrows deeper into the furs, seeking heat instinctively. The youngest and the oldest, the most vulnerable endpoints of human life. Both require protection. Both receive it, though for different reasons and with different levels of certainty. The child is the future if they survive. The elder is the wisdom that helps everyone else survive. Between them, the adults shoulder the burden of keeping both alive while also keeping themselves functional. It's exhausting, not just physically, the constant night vigilance, the interrupted sleep, the cold stress, but emotionally, the weight of responsibility for vulnerable lives when resources are limited and margins are thin. Every night you go to sleep wondering if everyone will wake. Every morning you check, quickly, efficiently, that all the bodies under the furs are still breathing, still warm, still viable. And then you do it again. For months. Until spring. If spring comes, it always has before. But in the deepest dark, that's not quite reassurance enough. The man sleeping 2 platforms over is missing 3 fingers on his left hand. Lost them in a skirmish somewhere in Frankish lands last summer. The wound healed, mostly, but he still favors that hand, keeps it tucked close to his body even in sleep. Winter is when warriors recover, or fail to. The Viking raiding season ran roughly from late spring through early autumn. This wasn't arbitrary. It was dictated by weather and navigation. You couldn't sail the North Sea or Atlantic in winter storms. You couldn't raid effectively when you were struggling just to stay alive against the cold. So summer was for violence, trade, and adventure. Winter was for dealing with the consequences. The injuries that seemed manageable in the heat of summer became serious problems in winter's cold. A wound that had closed but not fully healed could reopen in cold conditions as skin loses elasticity. Infections that had been suppressed by the body's immune system could flare up when that system was stressed by cold and limited nutrition. Broken bones that had been set and seemed stable could cause chronic pain that made sleep difficult and daily work nearly impossible. Vikings returned from raiding seasons carrying damage. Sword cuts, axe wounds, arrow injuries. The spectacular trauma that saga literature loves to describe. But also the less dramatic damage. Joint injuries from rowing for weeks, muscle tears from combat and heavy labor, dental problems from poor nutrition during campaigns, intestinal parasites picked up from unfamiliar water sources, lung damage from sleeping in wet conditions. All of this came home with the warriors. And winter was when they either healed or died slowly. The longhouse sleeping arrangements had to accommodate injured men who couldn't move normally. Someone with a serious leg wound couldn't easily climb onto a sleeping platform. They might need to sleep closer to the fire than normal, trading social status for accessibility and extra warmth that aided healing. Someone with torso injuries needed to sleep in positions that didn't stress damaged muscles or broken ribs. This meant they took up more space, disrupted the normal sleep clustering, and reduced the efficiency of the shared warmth system. The household had to adapt. Families had to decide how much inconvenience and resource allocation to dedicate to an injured warrior. If the warrior was the household head or a valued fighter, the answer was obvious. You did whatever necessary to preserve him. His leadership, fighting ability, and social connections were too valuable to lose. But for lower-status warriors, the calculation was more brutal. How much food, space, and attention could the household spare for someone who might not recover, who wasn't currently productive, and who might be permanently disabled? Some injuries were obviously fatal, just slowly. A deep wound to the torso that had closed, but clearly had internal damage. The warrior couldn't eat normally, was losing weight, had fevers that came and went. Everyone knew he was dying. The question was how long it would take and how much suffering would be involved. Norse culture had some provision for this. There are saga references to warriors choosing death over lingering decline. Sometimes this was framed as heroic, choosing to die in battle rather than waste away. Sometimes it was more practical, recognizing that survival was impossible and choosing to end it rather than burden the household through winter. Whether these choices were truly voluntary or represented social pressure is impossible to determine from surviving sources. Probably both, varying by individual circumstance. The sleep disruption from injured men was significant. Pain worsens at night. This is true across all human experience and was certainly true for Vikings. When you're active during the day, your mind is occupied and your body produces endorphins that suppress some pain. At night, lying still in darkness, pain becomes the only thing you can focus on. Injured men groaned, cried out, shifted constantly, trying to find comfortable positions. This woke others, disrupted the household's sleep, and created tension. Everyone understood intellectually that the injured man couldn't help it. But when you're cold, exhausted, and listening to someone moan in pain for the third hour of the night, understanding doesn't prevent frustration. Some households apparently tried to separate seriously injured men into different sleeping areas when possible. But in a structure where warmth depended on clustering together, isolation could be a death sentence for someone whose body was already struggling. The balance was delicate and must have varied by how much space and resources the household had available. Medical treatment during winter was limited. The herbs and medicines that might help had to have been gathered and preserved during summer and autumn. If you hadn't planned ahead, you had no options. Wound care in cold conditions was particularly challenging. You couldn't easily wash wounds with water that was either scarce or freezing. Removing bandages to check healing meant exposing injured tissue to cold air, which slowed healing and risked reopening wounds. So often wounds were simply left covered for extended periods, with the hope that they were healing underneath rather than festering. Sometimes that hope was rewarded. Sometimes it wasn't. And when the bandages finally came off in spring, you discovered rot had set in and the limb was lost. The psychological impact of winter recovery was significant. Warriors who'd spent summer active, engaged in raids or trade, full of purpose and adrenaline, suddenly found themselves immobilized in a dark longhouse. They were dependent rather than independent, vulnerable rather than strong, unable to contribute to household work while others carried their share. For men whose identity was built around physical capability and prowess, this was psychologically devastating. Some evidence suggests that winter depression in warriors, what we might now recognize as PTSD combined with seasonal affective disorder, was recognized as a distinct problem. The sagas mention warriors becoming silent, withdrawn, sometimes violent. Households had to manage these men carefully, keeping them engaged through storytelling and social connection, while also protecting themselves if the warrior became dangerous. Not every raider who left in spring returned. The sleeping platforms held empty spaces, sons who died in foreign lands, brothers who were captured or chose to settle elsewhere, fathers who never came back from the sea. These absences created their own problems. Missing labor meant others had to work harder. Missing bodies meant less heat generation in the sleeping cluster. Missing men meant widows and orphans who had to be integrated into other households or supported somehow through winter. The social fabric had holes torn in it each raiding season, and winter was when those holes became painfully apparent. You can hear the injured man's breathing now, rougher than others, occasionally catching as if something hurts when he inhales too deeply. He's trying to be quiet, trying not to disturb the household. But pain is hard to hide in silence and darkness. Someone, maybe his wife, maybe a brother, shifts closer to him. You hear whispered words, too low to make out. Comfort offered in the dark. It won't heal his wounds, but makes the night more bearable. And bearable is all winter asks. Survive until spring. Heal if you can. And if you can't heal, at least survive long enough to see sunlight again. That's the bargain. That's what warriors sleep through, night after painful night in the long dark. Here's what the sagas don't tell you. While the men recline on sleeping platforms, nursing their raiding injuries and telling stories about their summer exploits, someone is keeping everyone alive. That someone is almost always a woman. Winter survival wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about 1,000 daily tasks that had to be performed correctly, consistently, for months. And the burden of most of those tasks fell on Norse women. Let's start with the work you can see. Food preparation was constant. The dried fish had to be soaked to make it edible, then cooked over the fire. Preserved meat had to be sliced and prepared. Grain had to be ground, hard, repetitive work that destroyed women's joints over years. Bread had to be baked, though baking in winter was less frequent than in summer due to fuel conservation. Every meal required work, and every meal mattered for survival. Undercook the food, and you risked illness from bacteria. Overcook it, and you wasted precious nutrition and fuel. The margin for error was thin, and women managed it daily. Then there was textile work. This wasn't optional craft activity. It was life or death labor. Those wool layers everyone depended on for warmth. They wore out, developed holes, needed constant repair. Women spent hours each day spinning new thread, weaving fabric, sewing repairs to damaged clothing. The spindle and loom weren't hobby tools. They were survival equipment, as critical as weapons. A household that couldn't maintain its textiles would freeze. Archaeological evidence shows that women's graves often contained spindle whorls and weaving tools. These weren't just favorite possessions. They were markers of identity and essential skill. A woman known for exceptional textile work had status and value. She could keep her household alive through her production. She might even trade her work to other households, building alliances and social capital. Water management fell to women. In winter, this meant snow collection and melting. You couldn't just drink melted snow directly. It could cause digestive problems and didn't provide the minerals that well water contained. But wells froze, and streams were either frozen or dangerous to access. So women had to collect clean snow, melt it near the fire without wasting too much fuel, and manage the household water supply. This happened every single day. Ice collection from streams or lakes was even more demanding. Breaking through ice to reach water below was cold, wet, dangerous work. Women did it because it had to be done. The alternative was thirst, which killed just as surely as cold. Cleaning was a constant battle, not the thorough cleaning that would happen in spring. That was impossible in winter. But basic maintenance to prevent the longhouse from becoming completely filthy. Removing soiled straw from sleeping platforms and replacing it with fresh. Sweeping the earthen floor near the fire to prevent excessive ash buildup. Managing human waste, chamber pots that had to be emptied even in winter, carried outside into the freezing dark, dumped in designated areas. This was miserable, cold work. No one wanted to do it, so it fell to women and lower-status household members. Childcare was obviously women's domain in Norse society, and winter made it exponentially harder. Children couldn't play outside for extended periods. They were trapped indoors, bored, restless, making noise and causing disruption in close quarters. Women had to manage this, keeping children occupied, preventing fights, teaching skills, telling stories, all while also doing every other task required for survival. Modern parents who've experienced even a few days of children trapped indoors by weather know how exhausting this is. Viking women did it for months. Every year, for their entire adult lives. Medical care fell primarily to women. Treating wounds, preparing herbal remedies, nursing the sick, these were women's responsibilities. The knowledge of which herbs treated which ailments, how to prepare poultices, how to recognize symptoms of serious illness. This was largely female knowledge, passed from mothers to daughters. When a warrior came home with a festering wound, it was a woman who cleaned it, who applied whatever medicines were available, who monitored for signs of infection. If he died, it wasn't because she failed, it was because the injury was beyond what anyone could treat with the resources available. But she carried the psychological burden nonetheless. Here's what's particularly important. All of this work was invisible in the prestige economy. Men went on raids and came back with silver, slaves, and stories. This brought status, honor, fame that lived in saga literature. Women's work kept everyone alive through winter. But there were no skalds composing poems about excellent textile repair. No one achieved legendary status through superior food management. The work was essential but unsung. Historians are still fighting to recover and properly acknowledge women's contributions to Viking survival. For decades, archaeological focus was on weapons, ships, and raids, the masculine aspects of Viking culture. Only more recently have scholars systematically studied textile tools, food preparation, and domestic management. The picture that emerges is that Norse society literally couldn't have functioned without women's labor. The men might generate resources through trade and raiding, but women managed the transformation of those resources into survival. Sleep for women was different from sleep for men. Women often slept lighter, woke more frequently. They had to monitor children through the night. They had to wake to tend fires or address household emergencies. Their sleep was fragmented in ways that men's sleep often wasn't. This chronic sleep deprivation had health consequences that show up in skeletal remains, indicators of chronic stress, immune system suppression, earlier mortality, compared to societies where women's sleep was less disrupted. But there was no alternative. The work had to be done, and cultural norms assigned it to women. Some women had it worse than others. obviously. High-status women might have thralls to do the heaviest work. They supervised rather than personally hauling water or cleaning. But they still bore responsibility for ensuring the work was done correctly. A household that failed to survive winter reflected poorly on the woman managing it, even if she hadn't personally done every task. Lower-status women and female thralls did the worst work in the worst conditions. They slept in the coldest positions. They got the least rest. They received the poorest food. And they were expected to maintain the same work output as higher-status women with better resources and support. The compounding disadvantages were crushing. You can hear women working now, even in the night. Someone is at the fire, doing something, maybe checking food that's been slow cooking, maybe heating water, maybe just maintaining the flame. The quiet sounds of competent movement in darkness. Another woman's voice, soft, singing to a restless child. A lullaby that's probably centuries old, passed down through generations of women soothing frightened children through dark winters. The work never stops. Even in sleep, women's awareness continues. Listening for problems, ready to respond, carrying the household's survival in their consciousness. The men may lead. The warriors may fight. But the women keep everyone alive. Through skill, through labor, through relentless, exhausting care. Winter survival was women's work. And every person who woke in spring owed their life to countless hours of that invisible labor. Not all northern peoples slept the same way. Just beyond Viking territory, sometimes overlapping it, lived the Sami people. Indigenous to the Arctic regions of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia, they've been surviving northern winters for thousands of years before Vikings arrived. And their solutions to the cold were different. Instructively different. The fundamental distinction came down to mobility. Vikings built permanent structures, those massive longhouses we've been exploring, and committed to staying in one place all winter. Their survival strategy was fortress-based. Create a shelter so substantial that it could withstand months of siege by winter. The Sami, particularly the reindeer-herding groups, were semi-nomadic. They moved with their herds, following food sources and optimal grazing. This meant their shelters had to be portable. You can't carry a longhouse. So the Sami developed the lavu, a tent structure similar to the North American teepee. Wooden poles arranged in a cone, covered with reindeer hides, with a fire pit in the center and a smoke hole at the apex. The entire structure could be assembled in a few hours and disassembled just as quickly. For sleeping, the Sami used reindeer hides almost exclusively. Not surprising, given that reindeer were central to their economy and culture. But reindeer hide has specific properties that made it ideal for Arctic survival. The hollow hair structure traps air exceptionally well, even better than bear fur in some conditions. A sleeping person on a bed of reindeer hides, covered with more reindeer hides, could survive temperatures that would kill someone using other materials. The Sami also used reindeer hide sleeping bags, full enclosures that you could pull up over your head, leaving just a small breathing hole. This created a microclimate around the entire body, including the head, which Vikings typically left exposed. The trade-off was mobility versus security. The lavu was warmer in some ways than a longhouse. Smaller space meant easier to heat, and the cone shape naturally channeled smoke upward efficiently. But it was also more vulnerable to wind, required constant fire maintenance with no thermal mass to store heat, and offered less protection against the absolute worst weather. In truly catastrophic conditions, blizzards that lasted days, a lavu could be buried in snow or torn apart by wind. A longhouse would survive. Vikings and Sami weren't completely separate, of course. In northern Norway and Sweden, the territories overlapped. Trade happened, cultural exchange occurred, and sometimes intermarriage. Vikings adopted some Sami techniques, particularly for hunting expeditions into the interior. When Vikings traveled inland during winter for hunting or trade, they couldn't bring longhouses with them. So they learned to build temporary shelters using Sami techniques. Smaller versions of the lavu, or even simpler lean-to structures using available materials and reindeer hides. These weren't as warm or comfortable as home, but they worked for short-term survival. The sleeping arrangements in a lavvu were different from longhouse platforms. Everyone slept on the ground, well, on layers of birch branches and reindeer hides laid on the ground. The fire was central, and people arranged themselves around it in a circle, feet toward the fire. This put your feet, your extremities, hardest to keep warm, closest to the heat source. Your head was farther from the fire, but heads need less warming than feet. It was elegant thermal management. Historians document cases of Vikings adopting this sleeping arrangement during expeditions and finding it effective enough that some households may have modified their longhouse sleeping setups to incorporate the principle. Not fully. Platforms were still superior in permanent structures, but perhaps positioning sleeping platforms to optimize foot-to-fire positioning. The Sami also had different clothing strategies for sleep. Because they lived in smaller, more mobile shelters, they couldn't rely as much on structure for warmth. So their clothing had to be more effective. Sami winter clothing was often made from reindeer hide with the fur turned inward against the skin. This direct fur-to-skin contact provided more warmth than the Viking system of linen and wool layers. But it was less flexible. You couldn't easily adjust your insulation by adding or removing layers. You were either wearing your heavy reindeer parka or you weren't. For sleeping, some Sami apparently kept more clothing on than even Vikings did, essentially sleeping fully dressed, including their footwear. The logic was that in an emergency, a storm damaging the lavvu, for instance, you needed to be ready to respond immediately, already dressed for extreme cold. Vikings, in their more substantial structures, could afford to remove some layers. Food storage also differed in ways that affected winter sleep. Vikings stored large quantities of preserved food inside or very near their longhouses. They could access it easily throughout winter without significant exposure. Sami used frozen storage more extensively. Meat frozen solid in Arctic conditions stays preserved and can be kept outside. But accessing it meant going out into the cold regularly. This required different energy calculations. More calories burned retrieving food meant more calories needed overall. Some anthropologists argue that Sami winter survival actually required higher caloric intake than Viking survival, but that reindeer meat's high-fat content provided this effectively. The social dynamics of winter sleep also differed. Lavvu communities were typically smaller than longhouse communities, just immediate family rather than extended household. This meant fewer people generating collective warmth, but also less social friction and simpler hierarchy. Decision-making was faster, and sleep disruption from interpersonal conflict was reduced. The trade-off was less labor specialization. In a large longhouse, people could develop specific skills and roles. In a small lavvu, everyone had to be capable of everything. There's evidence that Vikings and Sami sometimes sheltered together during extreme conditions. A Viking hunting party caught in a sudden storm might be taken in by a Sami family, sleeping in their lavvu and learning their techniques. Or Sami traders visiting Viking settlements might stay in longhouses and observe their systems. This cross-cultural exchange meant that neither group's techniques remained pure. Vikings in far northern regions probably used more Sami-influenced methods. Sami near Viking settlements probably adopted some permanent structure advantages. Modern survival experts who've tested both systems report that each has advantages depending on specific conditions and needs. For permanent settlement and long-term survival, the longhouse system is superior. For mobility and adaptation to changing conditions, the lavvu approach works better. There's no single best way to sleep through Arctic winter. There are trade-offs, choices, adaptations to specific circumstances. You're lying on your sleeping platform in your Viking longhouse tonight, but you're aware that not far away, other people are sleeping differently, curled in reindeer hide sleeping bags and portable tents, using techniques developed over millennia by people who knew the Arctic even more intimately than Vikings did. Different solutions to the same fundamental problem. How do humans survive in places that should kill them? The answer is always some combination of technology, knowledge, and determination. The specific mix varies, but the underlying challenge is universal. Cold wants you dead. You have to want to live more than cold wants to kill you. And you have to be clever about how you fight that battle. Vikings were clever. The Sami were clever. And both survived against remarkable odds in some of the harshest conditions humans have ever chosen to inhabit. That's worth remembering as you settle deeper into your first tonight. You're part of a long tradition of human stubbornness, refusing to let winter win. Not everyone made it to spring. We need to talk about that, because all the planning, all the technology, all the careful preparation, sometimes it wasn't enough. Sometimes winter won. The historical record preserves accounts of catastrophic winter failures. Saga literature mentions winters so harsh they became legendary reference points. The winter when the ice reached the southern shores, or the year the snow buried the houses. These weren't myths or exaggerations. Archaeological and climate data confirm that certain winters were genuinely apocalyptic. The medieval warm period, which benefited Vikings in some ways by making Greenland and Iceland more habitable, also created volatility. Weather patterns became less predictable. A mild autumn could suddenly give way to a winter of unprecedented severity. And Vikings who'd prepared for a normal winter found themselves catastrophically under-resourced. What stores ran out first? You've been burning fuel continuously for months, and suddenly you realize the pile is diminishing faster than expected. Maybe the wood was damper than you thought, burning less efficiently. Maybe the winter is colder, requiring more fire. Maybe you miscalculated in autumn. The reason doesn't matter once you're facing the reality. You're going to run out of fuel before spring. The desperate solutions people attempted are documented in various sources. Burning furniture, sleeping platforms, decorative carved posts, anything wooden that wasn't strictly structural. This bought time, but destroyed the very infrastructure that made survival possible. A sleeping platform burned for warmth meant sleeping on the cold floor afterward. The immediate crisis was addressed by creating a longer-term crisis. Burning structural timbers, the ultimate desperation. Roof supports, wall posts, tearing apart the building itself for fuel. Some archaeological sites show evidence of this. Longhouses where load-bearing posts were clearly removed and burned, leading to partial roof collapse. The people inside were faced with an impossible choice: freeze with a roof over their heads, or stay warm briefly while their shelter disintegrated around them. Some chose warmth. Most of them probably died anyway when the structure failed completely. Food stores failing was even more catastrophic. Fuel could potentially be gathered. If you were desperate and strong enough to venture into the winter forest, you might collect wood even in deep cold. But food couldn't be manufactured from nothing. Once the stores were exhausted, starvation began. The progression is well documented in historical accounts from various cold climate famines. First, you ration more severely. Everyone gets smaller portions. You feel hungry constantly, but you're surviving. Then you start consuming things that aren't normally food. Leather, boiled until it's soft enough to chew, provides minimal nutrition but fills the stomach. Vikings had leather plenty. Shoes, belts, even some fittings on furniture. In extremis, it became food. Seed grain, the stores meant for spring planting, would be consumed. This was crossing a terrible threshold because it meant even if you survived to spring, you couldn't plant crops. You were mortgaging the future to survive the present. But hunger has a way of making long-term thinking impossible. The livestock that had been kept alive to provide warmth and future resources became immediate food. Slaughtering them solved the hunger crisis temporarily, but eliminated the heat they'd been generating. The longhouse got colder just as the inhabitants were getting weaker from malnutrition and less able to handle cold. Archaeological evidence from some sites suggests desperation slaughter. Animals killed and butchered hastily, bones showing marks consistent with extracting every possible bit of meat and marrow. Nothing wasted because there was nothing to waste. Cannibalism is the horror that historians dance around carefully. But we need to acknowledge it happened. Not commonly, not as accepted practice, but in the absolute worst situations when every other option was exhausted. Some saga references are ambiguous, stories of people eating forbidden meat during terrible winters. Some are more explicit. Whether these represent actual events or cautionary tales meant to emphasize the severity of certain winters is debated. But human desperation in starvation conditions is well documented across many cultures and times. Vikings facing the same conditions likely made the same terrible choices that others have made. Social breakdown accompanied these physical crises. The hierarchy we discussed earlier, the careful allocation of warm sleeping positions based on status, that could collapse when survival became truly desperate. Fights over remaining food or warm positions. The strong taking from the weak. Family bonds strained past breaking. Some saga accounts describe winter feuds that began over resource disputes. Someone taking more than their share, accusations of theft from stores, conflicts over who should receive priority treatment. In normal conditions, social pressure and legal consequences would contain these disputes. But when everyone is starving and freezing, normal social controls weaken. Thalls were particularly vulnerable when systems failed. They were already in the worst positions, receiving minimal resources, doing the hardest work. When food ran short, they were the first to have their rations cut. When cold became severe, they were the last to receive additional covering. Many probably died in their sleeping positions near the doors, and their bodies might not have been discovered until spring. Or they were discovered but couldn't be buried. Frozen ground made burial impossible, so bodies were simply moved outside and left for spring disposal. The archaeological evidence for winter disaster is sometimes subtle. Mass graves with remains showing signs of malnutrition and cold exposure. Longhouse sites abandoned suddenly, with evidence suggesting the structure was damaged or destroyed. Settlement patterns that show certain areas being depopulated after particularly harsh winters. One chilling detail that appears in some sources: the silence. Accounts of neighboring households checking on each other in early spring only to find everyone dead. Entire families frozen in their sleeping positions, having died quietly in the night when cold finally overwhelmed their failing bodies. The longhouse still standing, the door closed, but everyone inside gone. These weren't frequent occurrences. Most winters, most households survived. But they happened often enough to be part of collective memory. Every Viking going into winter knew that failure was possible, that all the preparation and skill and determination might not be enough if the winter was harsh enough or luck ran bad enough. You're lying on your sleeping platform, warm enough for now, and you're thinking about this, about the households that didn't make it, about the sleeping platforms that still held bodies come spring, about how fine the line is between survival and death. A few degrees colder, a few weeks longer winter, a calculation error in autumn about how much fuel you'd need. Any of these could tip the balance. You're alive tonight, but winter isn't over, and every night until spring is another roll of the dice. Another test of whether your preparations were adequate, your structure sound, your luck holding. The fear is there, quiet but constant. Underneath the furs, behind the breathing of your family, below the crackling of the fire. The knowledge that winter has killed before and could kill again. That survival is never guaranteed, only attempted. Night after long night after endless night. Until finally, mercifully, spring, if you're fortunate enough to see it. Light, not the pale ghost of winter sun, barely clearing the horizon for a few hours. Real light, light that lasts. Light that brings warmth with it. You can feel it even before you see it. A change in the air temperature, a shift in the quality of darkness. Winter is breaking. The first signs are subtle enough that you don't trust them. A day that feels marginally less cold than the previous week. Water dripping from the roof's edge where sun has melted a patch of snow. The fire doesn't need tending quite as constantly. You could dismiss any of these as imagination, wishful thinking born of months of deprivation and darkness. But then the signs accumulate. The livestock become more active, sensing the change in season through mechanisms older than human understanding. The children, who've been subdued and quiet through the darkest months, suddenly have energy again. Their voices rise, their movements quicken, their restlessness returns. Even the adults feel it, a lifting of the weight that's pressed down on everyone's spirits since autumn. The work of spring preparation begins before winter is fully gone. This is a dangerous time. Actually, you're exhausted from months of survival, your body depleted of nutrients, your immune system weakened. Spring brings warming, yes, but also meltwater and mud and disease. Illnesses that have been dormant through winter suddenly flourish as temperatures rise. The historical record shows that early spring was a peak time for deaths. People who'd survived the cold, but whose bodies had nothing left to fight spring illnesses. But for those who survive the transition, the relief is indescribable. The door of the longhouse opens more frequently now. Not the brief, desperate openings of winter, get in, get out, seal the cold away, but longer openings, letting fresh air circulate, airing out the smoke and smell and staleness of months of enclosed living. The first time you step outside without immediate life-threatening cold, it's almost shocking. The air is still cold, certainly, but it's tolerable cold. Cold you can exist in for minutes, even hours, without dying. The sky, when you look up, is no longer the oppressive black of polar night. It's blue, that color you'd almost forgotten existed. The sun, low on the horizon but present, moving, following its arc across the sky. You stand there, face turned toward that weak spring sunlight, and you can feel tears forming. Not from cold this time, from relief, from the sheer, overwhelming fact of survival. You made it. Your family, most of it, anyway, made it. The losses are acknowledged, mourned, but there's no time for extended grief. There's too much work. The longhouse needs repair. Months of heavy snow, ice formation, and structural stress have taken their toll. Gaps need sealing, damaged sections need replacing. The turf roof needs inspection and maintenance. This work can't be delayed because next winter is already coming. The sleeping platforms that served so well are stripped down. All that hay bedding, compressed and soiled over months, is removed and burned or composted. The platforms are cleaned, repaired where necessary, left bare for the summer. The furs that kept everyone alive are taken outside. They're beaten to remove dust and debris, aired in the spring sun, inspected for damage. The best are carefully stored for next winter. The damaged ones are repaired if possible, or cut down and repurposed. Nothing is wasted. These resources are too precious. And then, the moment many have been waiting for, the removal of winter clothing. Peeling off the layers of wool and linen that have been against your skin for months. The feeling is both relief and strangeness. Your body has adapted to being constantly covered, and sudden exposure to air feels almost vulnerable. Your skin is pale, marked with the pressure points where clothing has rested, possibly irritated or rotted in places where friction was constant. The first bath of spring is ritualistic. Water, heated in large quantities, used to actually wash the body rather than just minimally maintain it. The dirt and oil and sweat of winter sluices away. You might feel lighter, cleaner, almost reborn. Fresh clothing, if you have it, feels impossibly luxurious against clean skin. The social dynamics shift as people emerge from winter's forced intimacy. Tensions that built over months in close quarters can finally be released. People can separate, work individually, have space and privacy that was impossible through winter. Arguments that were suppressed for survival's sake can now be addressed. Some households that functioned during winter might split in spring. Extended family members going their separate ways, thralls being traded or sold, warriors departing for summer expeditions. The tight social unit that winter required loosens, becomes flexible again. Food becomes varied once more. The first fresh fish, not dried, not preserved, but fresh from streams and seas, is a delicacy that winter starvation makes taste like finest feast. Early spring plants, green and fresh, provide vitamins that have been absent from the diet for months. Your body craves these nutrients desperately, and consuming them brings noticeable improvement in energy and well-being within days. Sleep changes profoundly. You no longer need to sleep in full clothing, pressed against family members under heavy furs. You can sleep lighter, cooler, with space around your body. For the first few nights, This might actually feel strange. You've adapted to confined, heavily insulated sleep, and suddenly having freedom of movement feels almost uncomfortable. But quickly you readjust. Sleep becomes deeper, more restorative. Your body, no longer spending all its resources just maintaining temperature, can focus on healing and recovery. The damage winter inflicted, weight loss, minor frostbite, vitamin deficiencies, psychological stress, begins to reverse. The landscape itself transforms. Snow melts, revealing earth that's been hidden for months. Grass begins growing, tentatively at first, then with increasing vigor. Trees bud, birds return, ice breaks up in rivers and fjords. The world, which had been monochrome, white and gray, suddenly explodes with color. Green and brown, blue, and eventually the colors of flowers and new growth. It's almost overwhelming after months of visual deprivation. Planning for the next winter begins almost immediately, because the Vikings who survived understood a fundamental truth. Spring doesn't mean winter is over. It means winter is temporarily paused. It will return. It always returns. So as you enjoy the warmth and light and food of spring and summer, part of your mind is already calculating how much wood to gather, what repairs to prioritize, how much food to preserve, which livestock to keep through next winter, whether the household can support the same number of people, or whether adjustments need to be made. Survival isn't a single achievement. It's a cycle, repeated year after year. Each winter survived makes you more confident, but also more aware of what can go wrong. You know now, from experience, how thin the margin is, how much depends on preparation, luck, and the ruthless application of hard-won knowledge. Tonight, you'll sleep differently than you have in months. The door is open slightly, letting fresh air circulate. You're lying on the platform without heavy clothing, just light covering. Your family is near but not pressed against you. There's space, there's air, there's comfort. Outside, you can hear sounds of life returning. Birds, wind, and trees that are beginning to bud. The distant sound of water flowing as ice melts. Spring sounds, life sounds, the opposite of winter's deadly silence. You close your eyes, and for the first time in months, sleep comes easily. Not the exhausted collapse of winter survival, but genuine restful sleep. Your body relaxing, your mind releasing the constant vigilance that winter demanded. You're safe. For now. For this season. And that's enough. The Vikings understood something profound about survival. You don't triumph over winter. You endure it. You outlast it. You wake in spring and count who remains and begin preparing to do it all again. There's a kind of courage in that. Not the dramatic courage of battle, which saga literature celebrates, but the quiet courage of persistence, of facing the same deadly challenge year after year, of accepting the losses and continuing anyway, of sleeping through the dark and cold, night after night, trusting that spring will eventually come. And it does come. It always has. The sun returns. The earth warms. Life continues. You survived another winter. And that survival, as simple and undramatic as it might sound, is everything. It's the foundation upon which all of Viking culture rested. Without the ability to sleep through those ice-cold Nordic winters, none of the rest, the raids, the trade, the exploration, the sagas, would have been possible. Sleep was survival, and survival was victory. Night after night, winter after winter, 4 generations. The darkness is finally lifting. The cold is finally loosening its grip. You made it through, and now at last you can rest. Really rest, with the promise of warmth tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days of spring and summer ahead, until autumn comes again, and the cycle begins anew. But that's tomorrow's worry. Tonight, you sleep in peace. Spring has come. You survived. Sweet dreams.